Hey everyone, and welcome back to Stories for Sleep. I know a lot of you listen to these stories to help you relax and drift off to sleep. But before you close your eyes, I have a little favour to ask. If you can, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. It's always fun to see how many places around the world we're connecting with. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you never miss a new one. Now, it's time to get comfy and relax. Let's forget about everything for a moment and enjoy tonight's story together. Ready? Let's begin. It started slowly. Just a shift in the air, a tickling sensation at the back of the neck. At first, it was easy to dismiss, easy to chalk up to exhaustion or the quiet paranoia that always accompanies a new place, a new chapter. It was the kind of thing people talk about in the middle of the night, when the house is still and the only sounds are the creaks of old wood and the occasional sigh of the furnace. But soon it became undeniable. He had moved into the apartment just 3 weeks ago, a small, cramped unit in a building that had seen better days. The kind of place that had a certain charm to it, at least at first glance. The faded wallpaper, the worn wooden floors, the way the light came through the windows in the late afternoon, there was something nostalgic about it. Almost comforting, like something you might find in a second-hand shop, forgotten but still full of potential. But as the days wore on, that comfort started to fray. It wasn't anything overt, nothing that screamed danger or evil in big, bold letters. It was the little things. The way the air would feel colder when he was alone in the room. The way the walls seemed to whisper when the lights were off. And then, of course, there was the bed. Every night, he would lock the door to his room, check the windows to make sure they were secure, and crawl under the heavy quilt that had once belonged to his grandmother. It was a habit that had formed over the years, a need for routine, for control. The world outside felt unpredictable, and he needed something, anything, to ground him. So he locked the door, tucked himself in, and tried to ignore the growing sense of unease that had started to gnaw at the edges of his mind. But when he woke up the next morning, things had changed. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a slight shift in the covers, a crease where the blanket had been pulled back just a little too far. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he had just tossed and turned during the night. But as the days went by, it kept happening. The bed every single morning seemed to be just off. The sheets weren't where they should be. The pillows were slightly out of place. It didn't make sense. He never left the room. He locked the door every night, checked the windows, and when he woke up, everything should have been exactly as he had left it. But it wasn't. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination playing tricks. Maybe he was more tired than he realized, or maybe the room just had a draft that made the blankets shift. But each night, the unease grew, the sensation of being watched, of something lingering just out of sight, crept in like a shadow that refused to fade. It wasn't long before the dreams started. The first one wasn't anything unusual, just a strange, foggy vision of the room, his room, except the bed was different. The sheets were tangled, twisted into unnatural shapes. And in the corner of the room, something moved, something small, like the shift of a shadow that couldn't quite be caught. He woke up with a start, his heart pounding, his breath coming in quick gasps. The next night, the dreams came again. This time, the shape in the corner of the room was clearer, no longer just a shifting blur, but something with form. Something that almost resembled a man, but with too many limbs, too many joints. It was crouched near the bed, its eyes wide and unblinking. He wanted to scream, to get up, to turn on the light, but his body wouldn't move. His muscles were locked in place, frozen, as if whatever that thing was controlling him, commanding him to remain still, to stay quiet. When he woke up the next morning, his bed was worse than it had ever been. The blanket was twisted into knots, the pillows tossed aside like they'd been flung across the room. And there, underneath the mattress, was a note. It was small, folded, and tucked carefully between the box spring and the frame. His heart stuttered in his chest as he reached for it, his hands shaking. The note was yellowed, old paper with uneven writing that looked almost like it had been scrawled in a hurry. I was so close. The words didn't make sense. They didn't fit. His mind raced, trying to make some sort of connection, trying to decipher the message. But nothing came. His breath caught in his throat as he stood there, staring at the note, unable to comprehend what he was reading. He didn't know how long he stood there. A minute? An hour? It felt like time had stopped. The silence in the room was suffocating. The note was too much, too strange, too wrong. The first thought that crossed his mind was to leave, to pack up, get out, and find another place to stay. But something told him it wasn't that simple. He knew, deep down, that whatever was happening wasn't just confined to the bed, or the room, or the apartment. It was part of something bigger, something darker, something he hadn't seen yet. He inspected the bed frame. The wooden slats creaked as he pulled back the sheets, his fingers trembling as he ran them over the surface. There was something odd about the space underneath, the way the air seemed to grow colder, thicker, as if something was lurking there, just beyond reach. He dropped to his knees, peering under the bed frame. His eyes widened as he saw the deep, dark shadows that stretched beneath the bed. But it wasn't just darkness. There was movement there, something shifting just out of sight, too fast for him to catch. A cold chill ran up his spine as his hand shot out, reaching for the hidden space beneath the bed. His fingers brushed against something wet, something sticky, and he recoiled, his stomach lurching in revolt. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see, but he had to. He had to know what was hiding there. Slowly he pulled himself back from the edge, taking a deep breath as he straightened up. His hands were slick with sweat, and his heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what was worse, the thing he had just touched, or the fact that he had no idea what was waiting for him next. The room felt suffocating. The walls, once so comforting, now seemed to close in on him, the air thick with the smell of something old, something decayed. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but the more he thought about it, the more fragmented the pieces became. The note, the dreams, the bed, it was all connected. But how? And why? He took a step back, glancing at the door. His reflection in the mirror caught his eye, his face pale, eyes wide, bloodshot. But it wasn't just his reflection that looked back at him. Behind his own image, in the depths of the mirror, something else moved, something that shouldn't be there. His breath hitched, and the room grew even colder. And for the first time he realized whatever was happening in this room, whatever was under that bed, wasn't just a nightmare. It was real. It was no longer just a sense of unease. The air around him had thickened, saturated with something darker, something ancient. The reflection in the mirror, the thing that stood behind him, watching him with eyes that weren't his. He couldn't look away. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't stop. It wasn't just the way the air tasted now, like copper, like blood. It wasn't the cold that seemed to have sunk into his bones or the way his pulse raced in his ears. It was the knowledge that something was moving, just out of sight, underneath the bed. He had told himself it was a draft, a trick of the light, that was all. His mind was playing tricks. That was the story he clung to, even as his hand hovered over the bed frame, hovering above the place where the shadows seemed to creep, gathering in the dark corners of the room. That was the story he told himself, even as the note burned in his pocket. I was so close. It had gnawed at him all day. When he walked down the narrow hallway to the kitchen, the words had followed him. When he tried to eat, the taste of something foul lingered on his tongue, the note swimming at the back of his thoughts. He couldn't shake the sense that something was still waiting for him. He hadn't been able to sleep. Not really. He lay on his back, staring up at the cracked ceiling, listening to the creaks of the old wood beneath him, the sounds of the building settling in for the night. But every time he closed his eyes, every time he dared to drift into the haze of sleep, he saw it, whatever it was, watching him from underneath the bed. The figure with too many limbs, too many joints, eyes that weren't human. It was a blur of motion in the dark, always shifting, always just beyond reach. His mind was slipping, fraying at the edges. The days had become a blur, each one blending into the next. He had tried to distract himself, tried to go to work, to do the things that had once seemed routine, mundane. But everything felt wrong now, the weight of the room, of the apartment, pressed down on him. He could feel the walls closing in, could feel them shifting, warping into something else. And then there were the sounds. He heard them again the next night. Quiet at first. A scraping, like nails dragging across wood, or something much smaller, much more fragile, moving through the darkness. It was subtle, but unmistakable. He lay still, his breath caught in his throat, waiting for it to stop. The scrape, the shift, a faint shuffle. But it didn't stop. It came again, louder this time, like something or someone was dragging itself across the floor beneath him. There was a weight to it now, a presence. His chest tightened. His palms were slick with sweat, and his mouth went dry. Number. He wasn't going to look. He wasn't going to make the mistake of looking beneath the bed again. But the thing inside him, that nagging part of him, the part that had always been drawn to the dark places, the places he shouldn't go, urged him forward. It whispered to him like a voice in the back of his mind. Just look. Just once. What's the harm in that? He shook his head, gripping the sides of the mattress, willing himself to ignore it. He couldn't. Not this time. He pushed the blanket aside and swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet sinking into the cold, creaky floorboards. There was a moment of stillness, a deafening silence that settled over the room like a shroud. Then the scraping came again. It was closer now, much closer. His body moved before his mind could catch up with the fear that coursed through him. He was kneeling by the bed, his face inches from the dust-covered floor, eyes squinting into the blackness beneath. His breath came in shallow gasps as he peered under the bed frame. Nothing. But the room felt wrong, as though the air itself had thickened, pulled tight like a string stretched too far. There was a darkness there that didn't belong. And in that darkness there was something else. A shape. A movement. Something was there, just out of sight, something so close it might as well have been right next to him. It was like the shadows were alive, like they were watching him with eyes that weren't his own. He jerked back, scrambling away from the bed, his heart thundering in his chest. His hands were shaking violently now, sweat dripping down his face despite the cold. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he had just seen, or thought he had seen. The room, the shadows, they were playing with him. They had to be. But when he looked up again, the thing under the bed was not the only thing that had changed. The walls had shifted. It wasn't subtle, not anymore. The room felt smaller, tighter. The air felt heavy, weighed down by something he couldn't see, something he couldn't explain. The walls, once so familiar, were now strange, distorted, like they were bending in on themselves. Corners seemed to twist, as though they were being pulled inward, dragging everything around them along for the ride. His vision blurred, and for a brief moment he thought he might be dreaming again. But no, this was real. The sound of breathing filled the room. It wasn't his own breath, though. It wasn't even human. The air was thick with it, with something ancient and slow, something that had waited too long to be freed. The door to his room. It was locked, he was sure of it. He had locked it every night since he moved in, but now it was cracked open just a little. His heart pounded in his chest as his mind scrambled to make sense of what was happening. The walls were bending, the shadows were moving. The door, how had it opened? He didn't want to move, he didn't want to get closer, but something, some dark force, some malevolent presence was pushing him. It was calling him, pulling him toward the door, toward the thing that had been waiting, hiding in the dark corners of the room. He could feel it now, the weight of it, pressing down on him from every direction. His body felt heavy, like the very air had thickened into a viscous, suffocating fluid. He had to get out. He had to leave, but his legs wouldn't move. They were frozen in place, like the room itself was holding him there. A soft whisper echoed in the silence, coming from the shadows under the bed. I was so close. And then the door slammed shut. The room was darker now, the shadows thickening with a weight that pressed down on him like a physical thing. It wasn't just the absence of light, but the way the darkness seemed to swirl and coil in the corners, creeping closer with every breath he took. He tried to move, tried to push himself up from the floor, but his body was paralyzed. It wasn't fear, at least not entirely. No, it was something deeper, something colder. The air itself felt like it was holding him captive, like it had become a prison. He could hear the distant echo of his own heartbeat, the only sound in the suffocating silence, until that too faded, swallowed by the ever-present hum in the room. His hands shook, his palms slick with sweat as he reached up to feel his face, his forehead, to make sure he was still there. He could feel the heat of his skin, but the world around him had become so alien, so warped, that for a moment he wondered if it had all just been a dream. But the coldness, an unnatural, crawling coldness, reminded him it was real. That was when he noticed it. The door, the one that had slammed shut, was open again. Not just slightly cracked, as it had been before, but wide open, as though it had been waiting for him, urging him forward. A draught stirred the loose curtains, making them flutter like weak wings, casting shifting shadows against the walls. The room was no longer just stillness, it was watching him. Every creak of the floorboards, every breath of wind was an invitation to something else. He wanted to scream, to run, but his feet were glued to the floor. A sudden surge of panic clawed at him, but his mind was already too far gone, sinking into the realization that nothing was normal here, and whatever was beneath the bed, whatever was lurking in the dark corners of this place, had been waiting for him. The whisper returned. This time it wasn't just words, but a feeling, a presence, so tangible it almost felt like fingers brushing the back of his neck. I was so close. The voice wasn't human. It couldn't be. It was wrong, warped, like something ancient was trying to claw its way into his mind, to make him hear it, understand it. And then the sensation that had begun as an odd, creeping discomfort became something else. A cold, knowing fear. Something that had been beneath the surface all along, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It wasn't just the note. It wasn't just the dreams or the strange, unexplainable shifts in the room. No, there was something deeper, something buried in the fabric of this place, this apartment. It had taken root here long before he ever set foot inside, and now it was awake. A deep shudder ran through him as he slowly stood up, his legs unsteady, trembling beneath the weight of the air. His mind screamed at him to leave, to run, but his feet wouldn't obey. Instead, he turned toward the bed, the very thing that had been at the center of everything, the place where the shadows seemed to gather, where the darkness clung to the edges. It called to him. The floorboards creaked as he took a hesitant step forward. The bed frame was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was a doorway, a threshold. The thing that had been under it, whatever it was still there. He could feel it, like a static charge in the air, like something was waiting to crawl out of the dark and latch onto him. He stepped closer, the room growing colder with each movement. His breath clouded in front of him, and the smell of damp earth filled the room, mingling with the sickly sweet scent of something decayed. Then he heard it again. A soft shuffle, a scrape, the unmistakable sound of someone moving under the bed. He knelt down, hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the frame. His mind screamed at him to stop, but it was too late. His hand slipped beneath the bed, fingers brushing against the cold wood of the floor. He pulled it back quickly, but not before he felt the unmistakable sensation of something soft and wet. Something that shouldn't be there. A low growl vibrated from under the bed, and he froze, his heart hammering in his chest. It was low and guttural, like the sound of something feral, something desperate. He couldn't see it, not yet, but he could feel it, its presence, its hunger. And it was getting closer. With a sudden burst of panic, he yanked his hand back and scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was thick, as though it had turned to molasses, pressing down on him from all sides. He staggered backward, his back hitting the wall, his legs giving out beneath him as the room seemed to close in. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence. It was unbearable. He could hear the sound of his own heartbeat, thudding painfully in his ears, and yet the room seemed even quieter, as if something had sucked the very sound out of the space. The shadows under the bed were still, unmoving. The walls had stopped warping, the air had gone still. But the unease remained, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. He tried to force himself to move, to gather the strength to get out, but his body refused to respond. His limbs were frozen, as though the fear had seeped into his very bones. He turned his head slowly, glancing back at the door, still open, just a crack. But when his gaze shifted, his heart stopped. There in the doorway, standing just beyond the frame, was something. Something that wasn't there before. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow playing tricks on him, but as he stared, the figure solidified, growing more distinct with each passing second. It wasn't human, not in any way he understood. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face, if it could even be called that, was a void, a darkness that pulled everything toward it, a black hole that devoured any light that came near. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were wide, hollow and sunken, nothing but empty pits, but the worst part was its smile. A grotesque, twisted thing that stretched far too wide for any human mouth. And it was smiling at him. It reached out, its fingers elongated and thin like bones wrapped in skin. It didn't make a sound, not a whisper, not a breath, but the presence it exuded was crushing, suffocating. I was so close, the voice rasped again, the words slipping into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a noose. He couldn't move. He couldn't scream. He could only watch as the figure stepped closer, its presence filling the doorway, spilling into the room like darkness itself. And then the whisper stopped. The thing moved. It moved toward him. It wasn't the figure itself that made his skin crawl. It wasn't the elongated limbs, the unnatural bend of its joints, the terrible, impossible stretch of its mouth. No, it was the stillness. The unnatural way it didn't move, couldn't move, not the way things moved. In the world he understood. It was as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room, leaving only the presence of that thing. He should have screamed, should have run, but his body refused to obey. His feet felt nailed to the floor, his legs heavy and useless. It was as if the fear had wrapped around him like a thick rope, pulling him into some abyss of paralysis. The figure was standing just beyond the threshold now. Its smile, that grotesque, jagged thing, stretched further, wider, and it leaned closer, bringing the darkness with it. There were no features to it, no eyes that glinted with malice or hope, no expression of emotion, just that terrible grin. The thing seemed to fill the entire doorway now. The darkness of it, the weight, the presence that filled the room like it was made of something ancient, something that existed long before people and buildings and cities. It spoke again, but not with words. It spoke with thoughts. A whisper that entered his mind like a poison. It slithered around his thoughts, twisting them until he couldn't remember what it had been like to feel safe. It was almost like the air itself was alive, pulsing with its words. You're alone. The voice wasn't really a voice at all. More like a vibration in his skull. You've always been alone, haven't you? No, he wasn't alone. He couldn't be. Not here, not like this. But the thing in the doorway didn't care. It was closing in, its limbs dragging along the floor like something that had forgotten what it meant to walk. The smile, it was too big, too wide. It stretched across its face in a way that defied physics, its mouth extending, corners pulling back far beyond what was humanly possible. I was so close, it whispered again, the words slithering into his brain, making his thoughts scatter. He couldn't think straight, couldn't make sense of it. So close to being whole again. The thing tilted its head, and in that moment he saw something that made his stomach lurch, something that sent a shock of dread through him that he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. It wasn't just a figure, it wasn't just something that had been waiting for him, it was something else. The skin, if you could even call it that, was peeling away at the edges, revealing something darker underneath. Darker than the shadows, darker than the night itself. The skin was like old parchment, brittle and thin, stretched too tight over an unseen skeleton. It was as if the thing had been wearing the same facade for years, its flesh disintegrating, revealing the true shape of whatever it was. The true thing that had been hiding under the bed. His pulse roared in his ears, his heart hammered so loudly it drowned out everything else. And then the thing in the doorway began to move. It wasn't fast, it was deliberate, calculated. Slow steps, dragging its feet along the floor, leaving blackened streaks behind it. He could feel the cold from the thing's body, feel it like an icy tendril that reached out, curling through the air. It was a chill that wasn't from the room, not from the walls or the drafts. No, this was something deeper, something far older. He couldn't look away. It was drawing closer now, its thin, crooked hands reaching out, the long, bony fingers stretched in his direction like claws meant to dig deep, to hold on. His breath caught in his throat, and the air, thick with darkness, seemed to press against him. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. the apartment, the room. It had become a trap. The walls were closing in. The darkness wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside him. I was so close. The thing's voice, if you could even call it a voice, was barely audible, as though the words were too heavy to be spoken, too suffocating to leave its throat. It was as if the thing had been waiting for this moment. It had been inching closer, ever so quietly, until now. Until this very second. And then the realization hit him, clear and sharp as a knife. The thing wasn't just here. It was him. It had always been him. Every night as he lay in the bed, feeling that unsettling presence, that prickling sensation at the back of his neck, he hadn't been imagining it. It had been waiting for him, watching him, closer than he ever realized. Underneath the bed, beneath the mattress, it was the reason the bed always felt off, the reason the sheets were always disturbed, the reason the room felt wrong. It had been there the whole time, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the moment when he would finally see it for what it truly was. And now, it was almost here. It was too late. Before he could even react, before he could even think of what to do, the figure, no, the thing, was on him. It was cold. So cold he felt it like an electric shock, biting through his skin, seeping into his bones. The fingers, so thin, so wrong, wrapped around his wrist, pulling him forward. The touch was not just physical, it was invasive. It burrowed into his thoughts, his memories. There was a hunger in it, a ravenous, gnawing need that went beyond the physical. The thing was starving, and it needed him to complete it, to make it whole again, to bring it back from whatever dark place it had been hiding. "You don't understand," it rasped. "I was so close to being whole." It grinned again, that twisted, impossible grin that spread across its face, widening until it was a black, yawning chasm. And in the dark, in the space between breaths, it whispered the final words that shattered everything. "You're my last piece." And then the room went dark. It was no longer the room. It was no longer his body. All that was left was the dark. A void so absolute it swallowed everything, every thought, every breath, every shred of reality that had ever existed. His eyes were wide open, but there was nothing to see. No walls, no door, no bed, no floor. The air, if there even was such a thing anymore, was thick and suffocating, like the inside of a tomb, like a place where nothing could ever escape. The thing beneath the bed had become him. It had consumed him, pulled him into its cold, hungry darkness. Could feel its tendrils inside him wrapping around his mind, its presence now a part of his thoughts. He had tried to fight it, tried to scream, to move, to tear himself away, but the darkness pressed closer, closer until all he could taste was its hunger. It wasn't just a physical thing anymore. It wasn't just a figure in the doorway or something that had been lurking beneath the bed. It was him. He was the thing now. The thing was him. He could feel the cold crawl deeper into his skin, into his bones. He could feel it reaching into his soul. It spread like ice, like a virus, taking over every part of him, every part that was once human. He had been so close to escaping, so close to understanding, and yet it had pulled him down into itself, so far down that there was no going back. And still the whispering voice echoed in his mind, the voice that was both inside and outside of him. "You don't get it, do you?" It wasn't just words. It was an idea, a feeling. It was the sensation of being trapped in a place you could never escape, and the knowledge that the thing that had trapped you was still inside you, breathing, waiting. You were always mine. You've always been mine. It wasn't even a threat anymore. It was a truth, cold, unyielding, as inevitable as the coming of night. It had been there all along, even before he had moved into the apartment, even before the bed had started to feel wrong. It had waited, patient and still, for this moment. For him. He could feel the darkness wrapping itself around his thoughts, squeezing until the edges of his memories blurred and faded. There was nothing left now but the blackness, the vast, empty blackness, where nothing would ever be the same again. There was no escape. The apartment was gone. The bed was gone. The walls, the room, the world, all of it had disappeared into the suffocating black. All that remained was the thing, the cold, twisted thing that had been hiding under the bed all along. It had become him, and he had become it. It was over. There was no more room for thoughts of escape. There was only the darkness, the gnawing, hungry darkness that knew only one thing, that it had won. And then, just as everything was swallowed by the void, he saw it. The thing. It was standing there, just outside the edges of his vision, grinning at him with that impossible smile. The smile that stretched across its face, wider than any human mouth could ever go, wider than reality itself. The corners of its lips tugged back, revealing teeth. Teeth that weren't teeth at all. They were jagged like shards of broken glass, gleaming with a hunger that would never be satisfied. And its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were deep pits, dark voids that seemed to stretch into an endless nothing. They pulled him in, drawing him deeper into the blackness, deeper into the thing that had always been there. Its voice whispered one final time, the words filling every corner of his mind, echoing in his thoughts like a chant. "You're mine now!" He tried to scream, but there was no sound, no air, no voice. There was only the grin, that twisted, eternal grin that stretched wider and wider, swallowing him whole. And then, just as the last flicker of his human self began to fade away, just as the final remnants of his thoughts were devoured by the thing beneath the bed, he realized the terrible truth. The thing under the bed had always been him. It was the same thing. The thing that had been waiting, watching, hidden in the dark spaces of his mind. And now it had found a way to crawl out. It had finally come to claim him. And there was nothing left. The darkness closed in around him, swallowing everything, and then there was nothing. It's funny how the human mind works, how the simplest of things that shouldn't matter at all, can find their way into your mind and settle there, growing roots you can't shake. The first thing he noticed when he moved into the apartment was the smell, musty, old, like something had been rotting in the walls for years. But it wasn't just the smell, it was the walls themselves. As he unpacked the few belongings he'd brought with him, some clothes, a lamp, a few books, he couldn't help but notice the strange, intricate carvings etched into the plaster of the walls. They weren't deep or jagged like something carved by an amateur. No, these were smooth, precise, and disturbingly deliberate. The designs swirled around the room, covering every inch like a tapestry that had been woven into the very bones of the place. At first, he thought it was just the result of age, some old, forgotten decoration from a time before the apartment had been his. But the longer he stared at the carvings, the more uncomfortable they made him feel. They weren't just designs, they were alive. When he first moved in, the sensation was so subtle he almost thought he imagined it. The shapes seemed to shift, not in the way something would if you blinked too long, but in a way that felt deliberate. A curve would turn into an angle, and an abstract pattern would slowly seem to turn into something else entirely. Something that felt too human. But it always happened when he wasn't looking directly at them. Every time he turned away, the carvings would change. And when he turned back, they would be their original form again, leaving him wondering if he had seen what he thought he had. He put it out of his mind. It wasn't much, just a small apartment, just a new start. He didn't have time to obsess over every little thing. His job kept him busy, long hours at the office and late nights. He barely had time to eat, let alone dwell on the walls. Yet the carvings nagged at him, even when he wasn't paying attention to them. At night, when he was lying in bed, there would be moments when he swore he could feel eyes on him. Not just the sense of being watched, but the distinct impression that someone, or something, was peering through the plaster, staring through the space between the walls, from the other side. He shook it off. No one had lived here for years, and the apartment had been thoroughly cleaned before he moved in. There were no hidden peepholes, no one watching from the other side. It was just his mind playing tricks on him after a long day. Still, there was something about those walls that lingered in his mind. He tried not to look at them too much, to ignore the feeling that crawled up his spine whenever his gaze wandered toward them. But one night, after he had been working late again, something happened that he couldn't ignore. He was sitting at the small wooden desk by the window, a cup of coffee in hand, his attention a pile of papers. It was nearly midnight, and the apartment was silent, and the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of pages. The lamp on his desk cast a warm yellow glow over everything, but the rest of the apartment remained dark. It wasn't the darkness that unsettled him. It was the stillness, the strange, unshakable sense that something was moving around him, though he couldn't see it. His eyes flicked nervously to the walls, his pulse quickening. He couldn't stop himself. Something was different tonight. Something had changed. He placed the papers down and rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing against his eyelids. But when his eyes opened again, it was there, the carvings. They had shifted, the same intricate lines and patterns, the same swirls of symmetry, but something was different. Something had emerged from the designs. At first, it was hard to tell what it was. The shapes melded together like smoke. As he focused, as his gaze sharpened, he saw them. Eyes. 2 eyes staring back at him from the wall, just above the baseboard. They were small at first, just a faint hint of something watching, but as his heart began to thud in his chest, the eyes grew clearer, sharper. The irises were pale, almost translucent, and they had a depth to them that made him feel like they were more than just a pair of eyes. It was as if they were looking through him, studying him, waiting. His body tensed. He stood up too quickly, knocking the chair over. His breath came faster, louder in the stillness of the apartment. The eyes didn't blink. They just stared, unwavering, almost as if they had been waiting for him to see them. He turned away quickly, forcing his eyes to look anywhere but the wall, but the image lingered in his mind. The eyes didn't leave him. They were still there somehow, in his mind's eye, watching him even as he walked to the other side of the room. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself it was just his imagination, that he was tired, that he had been working too hard. But when he turned back, the eyes were gone. Or at least, he thought they were. He took a cautious step forward. His fingers brushed against the wall, where the eyes had been just moments before. He felt the carvings beneath his fingertips, cool and smooth, yet somehow strange. The lines of the design had shifted again, as though they were no longer what they appeared to be. He could still see the pattern, but it was as if it was now alive, like it was growing in the dark. The eyes were no longer just eyes. As he watched, the design continued to evolve. The eyes shifted, grew larger, took on more form, and then slowly, agonizingly, the face began to appear. At first, it was nothing more than an outline, just a suggestion, but as his gaze stayed fixed on the wall, the details became clearer. A nose, lips, the suggestion of hair. And all the while, those eyes, those terrifying eyes, stared at him from the plaster, unblinking. A cold chill ran down his spine, and the hairs on the back of his neck prickled. There was something familiar about the face that was forming, something he couldn't place. It looked like a person. No, it looked like someone he knew. The face was morphing, changing from one expression to another in the blink of an eye. First, it was neutral, then it was smiling, then it was frowning. But the worst part was the eyes. They never changed. Those eyes, the same eyes that had been watching him from the shadows, had a depth to them, a knowing look that made him feel like they had always been watching, like they had always been here, waiting. He stepped back, his heart racing in his chest, and the face, no longer just a carving, but a presence, seemed to shift with him, following him, its eyes never leaving him. The wall was alive. The eyes were watching him, and worse, the face. It looked like someone he knew. It looked like him. He didn't sleep that night. Not really. It was more like he floated in and out of a half-conscious state, his body a hollow thing, too afraid to let his mind rest, too afraid to close his eyes. The face on the wall, his face, kept invading his thoughts. Every time he tried to fall asleep, he would see it again, eyes wide open, staring from the smooth surface of the plaster, eyes that felt as if they were waiting. When morning came, it arrived with the same dull, oppressive atmosphere. There was no fresh sense of relief that usually accompanies the start of a new day. No sunlight streaming through the windows, no chirping birds outside. Instead, the apartment felt even more suffocating, as though the air itself had grown heavier, soaked with the unease of the night before. He tried to go about his day as if nothing had happened. He made coffee. He opened the blinds. He stared at the same walls that had made his skin crawl the night before. But the carvings, the strange, shifting lines in the plaster, remained. His gaze kept flicking toward the spot where the face had emerged, where his face had emerged. The sight of it made his stomach churn, the hairs on the back of his neck rising once more. But when he stood there, eyes fixed on that spot, the face wasn't there anymore. At least, not the way it had been. The smooth lines had returned, the intricate, abstract carvings that he had seen when he first moved in. They twisted in a way that almost seemed familiar now, but the face, the eyes, they were gone. For the rest of the day, he couldn't help but feel like he was being watched. He could almost feel the weight of invisible eyes pressing against him, tracking his every movement, following him like a shadow that wouldn't leave. At one point, when he went to the kitchen to make a sandwich, he froze in the doorway. His heart skipped a beat. There, just at the corner of his vision, was a brief flash, a flicker of movement on the wall. He swore he saw the corner of an eye shift, as if it was peering out from the plaster. But when he turned his head to look, nothing was there. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening to him, to his mind, his own mind, the one that had always been sharp, reliable. Now it was slipping, falling into strange places. Maybe he was losing it. Maybe this was what happens when you live in a new place for too long, when you start obsessing over the things you can't understand. But then again, it wasn't just his mind that was playing tricks on him. It was the walls, and they were alive. Later that evening, after the sun had set, and the apartment was swallowed by the weight of night, he found himself back in the same spot, the small desk by the window, staring at the same patch of wall, the same carved patterns. But tonight, something was different. He didn't want to look, but he had to. He didn't know why. He stood there, staring at the spot where the face had appeared, the place where he knew the carvings were hiding something more than just meaningless designs. The air seemed thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on him, keeping him from breathing properly. Then, just as before, he saw it. At first, it was barely noticeable. A subtle shift in the shadows, a slight distortion in the carved lines. He rubbed his eyes, but when he looked back, the lines had begun to twist again, just like they had the night before. But this time, they moved more quickly, like they had been waiting for him to see them. The eyes reappeared first, only this time they were more pronounced, more demanding. No longer just vague shapes in the wall, they were real, solid. They stared out from the plaster, intense and unblinking, like they were looking straight at him, watching him with an intensity that made his stomach turn. He stepped closer, his pulse thumping in his ears, and then it happened. The rest of the face emerged, slowly, agonizingly slowly, until it was fully formed, staring at him with those cold, unblinking eyes. The face was now undeniable, its features sharper, clearer. A full mouth, wide and thin, high cheekbones, an unsettling smile that stretched across its face, twisting the expression into something that made his skin crawl. It wasn't a smile of happiness or of joy or even amusement. It was a hunger, a dark, gnawing hunger. It was the kind of smile that could only come from something that had been trapped, something that had been waiting to emerge for far too long. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the smile shifted. It wasn't just a smile now. Face grew darker, a shadow seemed to wash over it, its features blurring and reforming, twisting and contorting into something else entirely. The eyes, that piercing, accusing stare, were still there, but now they seemed to burn with something else. There was a flicker of recognition in them, a hint of something he couldn't place. The shape of the face seemed to shift, almost like a mirror, and it became clearer. The face was now unmistakable. It was his. The realization hit him with a cold, sickening clarity. It wasn't just a likeness. It wasn't just a random face that happened to look like his. This was his face. But it wasn't quite right. The features were distorted, twisted in a way that he couldn't fully comprehend, like a reflection in a broken mirror. It smiled again, and this time there was something else in its smile, a knowing, a wicked understanding that made his blood run cold. He stumbled back, his breath ragged, chest tight with panic. His hands shook, his knees weak beneath him. He couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in. And then the whisper started. Soft at first, so faint that he wasn't sure if it was real or just a figment of his imagination. It's time. The words weren't in his ears, they were in his head, in his mind. He glanced back at the wall, but the face had faded, slipping back into the intricate, shifting patterns that had marked the wall when he first arrived. But he knew it was still there, waiting, watching. His breath hitched in his throat. The voice, the whisper, it hadn't come from the wall, it had come from inside him. And then, before he could even process what was happening, the wall shifted. The face reappeared, faster now, growing stronger, its features sharper, more defined. But there was something else, something alive. He couldn't escape it. It wasn't the kind of thing you could run from, not when it had found you. The walls, the carvings, those eyes, they were all part of the same suffocating puzzle that had already begun to consume him, piece by piece. The next day, the morning after the face had reappeared, he tried to go about his usual routine. He forced himself to eat, to leave the apartment, to get out and breathe air that wasn't thick with the scent of dust and something far older, far darker. But nothing felt the same. Not anymore. The apartment felt wrong. The silence that had once been comforting now felt oppressive. He hadn't realized how much noise he had once taken for granted. The hum of the refrigerator, the clink of dishes in the kitchen, the distant sound of traffic outside the window. Now everything seemed muted, as if the walls themselves had absorbed all the noise, leaving him alone in a suffocating vacuum. When he returned that evening, the same sensation crawled up his spine. The eyes. He could feel them on him the moment he stepped inside. The apartment hadn't changed. In fact, nothing about the place seemed any different. The furniture was exactly where he had left it, the air as heavy as ever. But the walls, they were alive again, shifting ever so slightly in his peripheral vision. As soon as his gaze flicked toward the wall where the face had first appeared, he knew. It was there. The face, his face, had returned. This time, though, it wasn't just a face anymore. It was a presence. The eyes, deep and knowing, were still locked onto him, but now the face had twisted, had warped into something grotesque, something other. The expression that had once been unsettling now seemed almost predatory, like it was studying him, waiting. He stepped back, the world spinning in his mind. He had to get away. He had to leave, to get out of this place before it consumed him entirely. But the moment he thought it, he knew it was useless. There was no escaping it, not anymore. His heart raced. Sweat dotted his forehead, his fingers trembling as he reached out to touch the wall. It was as cold as ice, but it didn't feel like a normal wall. The surface seemed to pulse, almost alive, as though the plaster had become something more, a living thing, breathing, shifting beneath his fingertips. And then, as his hand hovered above the carvings, he felt it, a tug, like something was pulling at him from the other side of the wall, dragging him in. His stomach lurched, the pull of it becoming stronger, deeper. It wasn't just the carvings that had shifted. It was the whole apartment. He could hear it now, the faintest whisper, almost imperceptible over the pounding of his own heartbeat. At first, it was just a sound like the wind pushing against the windows, or the distant murmur of voices from somewhere far away. But as he listened, the whispers began to take shape, forming words that scraped against his skull, made his mind feel raw. It's almost time to come home. His breath hitched in his throat. The voice, no, the presence, was inside him now. It was no longer just on the wall. It wasn't confined to the plaster. It was inside his head, slipping into his thoughts, wrapping around them like a vine, curling deeper and deeper. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his forehead, trying to push the sensation away. His fingers trembled, digging into his scalp as if he could tear the thought from his brain. Stop! Stop! Just stop! But the voice didn't stop. The presence didn't stop. It was only growing stronger, feeding off his fear, feeding off the uncertainty that clung to his every movement. It's been waiting a long time, and now you're here. He couldn't take it. The apartment, the walls, the voice, they were all closing in on him, pressing against him, trapping him in a place where there was no escape. The fear was raw now, jagged, eating away at his insides like a disease. He turned on his heels, eyes frantic, searching the room, looking for something, anything that could help him make sense of it. He had to understand. He had to find out what the hell was happening, why this was happening, and why it felt like the world was unraveling at the seams around him. And that's when he saw it. Not the face. not the eyes. Something else. Something worse. The walls were changing. Not in the way they had before, not in the subtle shifting of shapes or patterns that had made him question his sanity. No, this was different. The walls were moving. The carvings seemed to stretch and warp, twisting into shapes that no human hand could have created. And worse, far worse, was what was taking shape within those shifting lines. It wasn't just the face anymore, it was hands, long, pale fingers that seemed to reach out from the wall, creeping toward him. His heart skipped a beat. He took a step back, but the movement was slow, too slow. The fingers, they were too close now, too real. This was happening, it was happening right now. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't think. His legs were shaking beneath him as if they couldn't hold him up anymore. The eyes, the face, the hands, everything was pulling him in, as if the very fabric of the apartment had come alive, weaving around him, trapping him in a place where escape was impossible. The whispering grew louder, closer. It was no longer just a voice. It was a presence, a feeling that pressed down on his chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. You can't run, you're mine now. A cold sweat broke out over his skin. He was no longer in control of his own thoughts. The fear, the terror was too much. His mind was unraveling, his sanity was slipping. And then, just as he thought he would collapse, just as the walls seemed to be closing in, something in his gut screamed, "Get out!" He didn't know if it was his own voice or something else, something that had been inside of him the whole time, but he didn't wait to question it. He turned on his heel, his legs carrying him toward the door, toward the only escape. But as his hand gripped the doorknob, something stopped him. It wasn't physical. No, this was something worse. It was as if the air itself had solidified, as if the apartment itself had become a barrier, keeping him in, keeping him locked in place. And when he turned back, the face was waiting for him. Those eyes, those cold, dead eyes, staring from the wall, from inside him. The door was locked. It didn't matter that his hand gripped the cold brass knob with desperation, with panic. It didn't matter that his knuckles were white from the force with which he twisted it. The door would not open. There was no escape. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, each inhale feeling more like a death rattle than the filling of his lungs. His chest constricted, and his heart beat out a frantic rhythm, so loud he thought it might shatter his skull. The walls, those damned walls, seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't comprehend. They watched him, waited for him. He didn't dare look back, not at first. The voice in his head, the one that had started as a whisper and now screamed inside his mind, urged him to move, to get away, to run. But where could he run to? The apartment was closing in, the very air suffocating him. The darkness pressed against his skin, crawling over him like 1,000 unseen hands. And then, like an invisible weight pressing on his shoulders, it hit him. The realization, the walls weren't just alive, the apartment itself was alive. The air, the space, the very foundation under his feet. It was as if the apartment had become something else entirely. A living thing, a beast. He stumbled back from the door, his legs giving way beneath him. His head spun, the room tilting like a funhouse. The carvings on the walls, they were moving again. It wasn't just the abstract lines now, twisting and writhing like living tendrils. Number now, there were hands reaching out of the plaster, fingers stretching toward him. He couldn't look at it, but he couldn't stop. There they were, pale fingers with nails that seemed too long, too sharp, digging into the wall, pulling themselves free from the very surface of the plaster. The hands emerged, one after another, as though they were reaching for him, stretching out from the wall like they had a purpose. like they were calling him. He stepped back, heart pounding in his throat, but the hands, they followed him. One hand gripped the edge of the desk, the other ran along the floor, dragging itself toward him, pulling at the edges of his reality, threatening to tear him apart. The fingers were real. They were long and skeletal, dripping with a darkness that shouldn't exist. And worse still, there was no break between the carvings. The hands didn't appear and vanish like shadows. They were as much a part of the wall as the rest of the grotesque design. He tried to move, but it was like the air itself was holding him in place, anchoring him to the ground. The presence, that thing that had haunted him from the start, was closer now, filling the room. The face, that damned face, was back too, but this time it wasn't just his face, it wasn't just a mirror of his features. Number the face had twisted again. It had grown darker, older, as if it had been slowly deteriorating right in front of him, morphing into something that he couldn't even recognize. Still, those eyes, they were the same as they had been the first time, staring at him from the wall, unblinking. But this time, they seemed to glow, faintly, an eerie luminescence pulsing from deep within them, like something alive, something that knew him, that knew the very fabric of his soul. And as the eyes locked onto his, the whisper returned. It was louder now, more insistent, like the thing behind the wall was speaking directly to him, no longer just inside his head. Come closer. His stomach turned, nausea rising in his throat. He wanted to scream, to shout, to run, but his body was frozen stiff, like something had locked him in place. His legs wouldn't move, his hands wouldn't obey. The air was thick with the stench of fear, his fear, and the apartment seemed to pulse in time with the rising panic in his chest. The face smiled at him again, but this time there was no warmth, no semblance of humanity, only that hunger, that endless gnawing hunger. And then, like a wave crashing down on him, the hands came. They reached for him, long, bony fingers grasping at his clothing, his arms, his skin. They were everywhere. No, not real. They can't be real. He felt the touch of something cold and clammy, and then something sharp. A finger, its nails scraping down his arm. He screamed, but the sound was lost in the thick, suffocating silence of the room. His voice, his life, was being swallowed by the apartment, by the thing in the walls, by the thing that had once been human, but was now something more, something worse. He felt the walls shift again, heard the scraping sounds, the pushing and pulling of the plaster, as if the walls were alive with something that had always been there. He had to get out. He had to. With every ounce of willpower he could muster, he forced his body to move. His legs were weak, unsteady, but he shoved his hand against the door again, his fingers trembling as they gripped the knob. The walls were tightening around him, squeezing, pulling him in. It was as if the apartment itself were trying to eat him, to consume him whole, to swallow him into the darkness. He turned the knob. It wouldn't budge. His heart crashed in his chest, and for a moment he was sure the world would end right there, in this cursed place. But then, just as quickly as the hands had appeared, they vanished. The pressure lifted, the whisper stopped. The air, though thick, was suddenly still. Silent, but not for long. A soft scratching noise came from the walls, so faint that it might have been mistaken for a mouse. But the more he listened, the more it became clear. The sound was too deliberate, too measured, too human. It was coming from the wall again. And this time, it wasn't just the face, it wasn't just the eyes. It was a hand pushing through the plaster. The hand came through the wall. It wasn't just the fingers, not just a few grotesque shapes, groping their way through the plaster like something out of a nightmare. This was more. The fingers pushed through first, pale and skeletal, their tips dragging against the plaster as if they were testing the wall's resistance, like they had all the time in the world to breach this barrier. They were so long, so unnaturally long, the nails scraping against the surface with a sound that made his skin crawl. The first thing he did was run. He didn't think, he just ran. His legs moved before his mind could catch up. Instinct screaming louder than the rational part of his brain that was still clinging to the hope that he could get away, that he could somehow escape this nightmare. But the moment he took a step back, the wall seemed to move with him. It shifted. The plaster groaned, as if something in the apartment was stretching, bending, shifting in response to his every move. It wasn't just the hand anymore. The wall was alive. The entire space, the whole apartment, had become part of the thing that was haunting him, part of something ancient, something other. It was as though the very air was pulsing, like it was filled with some kind of dark, viscous energy. He could feel the pressure against his chest, pushing him, forcing him toward the wall. His breath came in quick gasps, his throat tight with the effort to scream, but his voice was gone. He glanced toward the door, the only escape he had left, but before he could even take another step, the hand, the thing that had begun this entire nightmare, pushed through again. This time, the hand was followed by a wrist, a thin, unnervingly long wrist, its skin grey and mottled with veins that twisted like dying roots. It was not a human wrist. It was wrong, the way it bent at an unnatural angle, the way the skin stretched over bones that shouldn't exist in the living world. He couldn't look away. He tried to close his eyes, to block it out, but his body was frozen. The pressure inside him was unbearable. The walls were closing in on him, the floor beneath his feet groaning in protest, and the hand was pulling itself free, inch by agonizing inch. The fingers curled around the edge of the wall like a spider's legs creeping over the surface, but when the hand finally broke through fully, the thing that followed it wasn't just a hand, it was a face. Not the face of the man from the wall, not his own face, twisted into a grotesque semblance of hunger. No, this face was far worse. It was the face of something ancient, something that had never seen the light of day, something that had been waiting in the dark corners of the walls for centuries. The features were blurred, not fully human, like it had been carved out of stone, but with eyes, those awful eyes, staring directly into his. They were the same eyes, his eyes, but they were also other, and they were hungry. It was the smile that tipped him over the edge. The thing, the face, smiled, and that smile was pure malice. It wasn't a smile of amusement or joy, it was a smile of triumph, of victory. The thing had won. And then, as if on cue, the entire wall began to tear open. Carving, the face, the hands, all of it started to erupt from the wall. It was as if the plaster had been holding the thing back, holding it inside for far too long, and now it was finally breaking free, bursting out into the room like a parasite that had been waiting to feed. The walls groaned, the apartment rattled, the floor buckled beneath his feet, cracking like dry earth under a heavy storm. The thing on the wall didn't just crawl out. It emerged fully, in a sickening mass of dark flesh and broken, fragmented pieces of the wall, like a monstrous amalgamation of stone and skin. The face, the hands, they were all part of this creature now, and they moved. They shifted and writhed, forming into something alive, but it was still his face. Still his eyes, and they were looking right at him. "It's time," the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't inside his head. This time it was outside. It was coming from the thing in the wall, speaking with a voice so deep and hollow that it seemed to come from the very bones of the apartment itself. "It's time for you to join me." Panic, flooded his veins, and for a split second he thought he could fight it. He thought he could push back, that he could overcome the fear that paralyzed him. But then the hands reached out. This time they weren't just groping toward him, they were grabbing. They seized him by the arms, dragging him toward the thing that had once been the wall, pulling him into the mass of shifting darkness and twisted flesh. His feet lifted off the ground, his body suspended in mid-air, held by something far stronger than anything he had ever known. The room was spinning, the walls were closing in. The apartment, the place that had once been his refuge, was now the very thing that was consuming him, pulling him in, swallowing him whole. His scream was lost as the face loomed above him. Those eyes, his eyes, glaring down at him with satisfaction. And then there was nothing. It had started with the sound of the water. The sound, the rhythm, that deep, drowning thrum of the ocean's heartbeat had once been the thing that comforted him. It had been the thing that had lured him, in the first place, to the water. He'd always felt at home there, floating on the surface, the salt air filling his lungs, the weightlessness of it all giving him peace. But after it happened, after the accident, the sound, the rhythm, it was no longer peaceful. It was an omen, a warning, a beckoning from the depths. Luke had never been the type to believe in things like fate or signs, not the type to wonder about what happens to you when you die or what waits after. But the water, it had taken something from him. He wasn't sure what exactly. It wasn't his life, not exactly. He hadn't drowned. He had survived. But when he'd been pulled from the waves, when they dragged him, half-conscious and soaked, onto the boat, the ocean had left its mark. And that mark, it seemed, was not something you could wash away. When Luke had been rescued, the first thing they'd asked him, once he could finally spit the seawater out of his lungs and start breathing again, was if he could remember anything. What had happened out there, on that stretch of empty water, where the boat had capsized? They'd asked him if he'd seen anyone, if anyone else had been thrown overboard with him. The answer was always the same. I don't know. He didn't remember much of the accident, not the feeling of the boat tipping, not the sound of the waves crashing, just flashes, brief glimpses of his hands flailing beneath the surface, his heart hammering in his chest, water rushing into his mouth, drowning out all the sounds of the world. And then blackness. Silence. He had woken up on the boat, coughing, sputtering, surrounded by strangers in brightly coloured life jackets. His limbs ached, his head ached, but he was alive. And that's all that mattered, right? That's what he told himself, at least. You survived. The rest of it doesn't matter. Except that it did. After they'd patched him up, after they'd made sure he wasn't going to die on them, they'd asked him again about the other person who'd been with him, the one who hadn't made it out of the water. He couldn't remember them. He didn't know them. But he could hear their voice. And that was the strangest thing of all, because they hadn't found anyone else. No body, no trace of anyone else having been out there with him. Just him. Just Luke. It started slowly at first. When he was back in his hotel room just a few hours after they'd brought him in from the ocean, he heard it. It was faint at first, like a whisper beneath the hum of the air conditioning. Luke. Luke. The voice, soft and distant. So distant that at first he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. It had to be. Right? He'd just nearly drowned, nearly died. Of course, his mind was going to be messed up, a little fuzzy. It was normal. Everything was fine, except it wasn't fine. The voice was still there. Even after he closed his eyes, even after he tried to sleep, the whisper never stopped. Luke. Come back. Come back. It wasn't a voice he recognized, not at first. It wasn't like it was a memory of a friend or a lover. or even a stranger he'd passed on the street once. This voice was deep, otherworldly almost, like it came from beneath the earth, beneath the waves. It had a quality to it that felt ancient. But there was something else too, a chill, a presence, something familiar, like a lingering shadow that wouldn't leave. And it wasn't a memory, but it wasn't a dream either. This was happening. This was real. The next day, the voice was louder. He was sitting on the balcony of the hotel, looking out at the horizon where the water met the sky, trying to calm his racing mind, trying to breathe in the salty air and feel normal. But the voice came again. "Luke, come back to me. Come back." He jerked his head around, searching for any sign of movement, any source for the voice. Nothing. Only the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore, the distant sound of children playing near the water's edge. It was the silence that followed the voice that made it worse, though. The stillness that filled the empty spaces after the whisper, a vacuum of sound so thick it was suffocating. "Okay," Luke muttered to himself, his breath coming in short bursts. "Okay, this is fine, I'm fine." But he wasn't. He hadn't been since he woke up in that boat. The voice was a nagging thing now, a creeping presence in his mind, a cold hand on his spine that never seemed to loosen its grip. Each time he heard it, it felt like something was crawling deeper into his mind, taking root in his thoughts. The more it spoke, the less he was sure of himself, of reality, of what he had seen and heard out there on the water. At first, he thought it was the sea, the trauma, the salt water in his lungs, the fear of nearly dying. Maybe it was all just his mind, trying to reconcile the fact that he was still alive, while someone else had drowned. Maybe I'm just imagining it, he thought. Maybe I'm just going crazy. But then it happened again. That night, in his room, the voice came to him in a dream. Or so he thought. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking out over the ocean. The waves crashed violently against the rocks below, the wind howling in his ears, the salt water stinging his skin. And in the distance, there was a figure, a shape, indistinct and shadowy, moving toward him through the mist. The figure's face was hidden, its features indistinguishable, but the voice, it came again. "Luke, I'm still here. Come back to me." He awoke with a start, gasping for air, his heart thundering in his chest. The dream, or whatever it had been, was so real, so vivid, that he couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more than just a nightmare. Something that was calling to him. And the voice. It wasn't just a call from the past anymore. It was a command. "Come back to me. Come back. And see what happens next." Luke sat in the small, dimly lit hotel room, the air thick with salt and humidity, his fingers gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing holding him to this world. The sound of the ocean, once comforting, now pressed against the walls like something alive, something insistent, clawing its way in. It was louder tonight, louder than it had been since he first stepped foot on this cursed shore. The waves crashed against the rocks with a rhythmic force that felt like a beating heart, and beneath that, the voice. Luke. It was clearer now, unmistakable. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a voice, deep and resonant, pulling at the edges of his mind. He hadn't been able to shake it since the moment he woke up in that boat, the taste of salt still thick on his tongue, the memory of the cold, dark water rushing over him, filling his lungs. The voice wasn't just a figment of his imagination, it was real. He told himself that, over and over, like a mantra, a desperate plea. It couldn't be real, it had to be a hallucination, a byproduct of the trauma, a leftover, a fragment of something broken in his brain. But now that it was so much clearer, the voice, he wasn't so sure. The first night, When he had heard it, he thought he was just imagining things, still half drunk on the memory of almost dying. But then it came again the second night in a dream, or so he thought. But even in the dream, even in the feverish heat of his sleep, it hadn't felt like a dream. The voice had been so tangible, so alive. The way it called his name, the way it reached for him, not from the past, but from somewhere else, somewhere deep, somewhere dangerous. "Come back to me." That had been the message. Luke tried to shake it off. He tried to rationalize. It's nothing. It's just the sea. It's all in your head. But it didn't stop. The voice wasn't going to let him go, and as he stood up from the table, his hands trembling, his heart thudding in his chest like a drum, he realized he was getting closer to something. A truth. A horrible, twisted truth that had been hiding beneath the surface of his mind, just out of reach. It was like a puzzle with pieces that kept slipping through his fingers every time he tried to put them together. The more he tried to ignore it, the louder the voice became, until it had consumed him entirely. It was calling from the ocean. The thing that troubled him the most, though, was the feeling that the voice was waiting for him. It knew. It knew something he didn't. It had to, because every time the voice called to him, he felt like it was saying more than just his name. It was asking him to come closer, to dive deeper into the abyss. And worse, he realized now, slowly, inevitably, that the voice wasn't from the past. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some lost soul who had drowned with him. It was from the future, a future where he was meant to return to the sea. You survived once, but you won't survive again. Luke couldn't even breathe for a moment as the realization hit him like a tidal wave. He was going to drown. The voice wasn't calling him back from the past. It was warning him of the future, of the dark, cold water that was waiting for him. It was telling him that the ocean wasn't done with him, that whatever happened before wasn't the end. The sea had plans for him. It was calling him, drawing him in like a siren song, like a lure to a fish too naive to see the hook. But that couldn't be right. It didn't make sense. He wasn't going back into the water. He couldn't be. He had survived, hadn't he? His mind was spinning, the walls of the room closing in, the ocean pressing at his window, its dark secrets creeping through the cracks. The air felt too thick, too heavy, and it tasted like salt and metal. Every breath he took felt like it was pulling him under, dragging him deeper into something he didn't want to understand. It was the smell of the sea that did it, the faintest trace of brine that lingered in his nose that seemed to follow him no matter where he went. The voice came with it. "Luke, you can't escape me. Come back." He grabbed his jacket, his mind moving on autopilot, his body reacting before his thoughts could catch up. He had to leave. He had to get away from the water, from the voice. But as he stumbled out into the night, the winds whipping at his hair and the salt of the air biting at his skin, he realized the truth. There was no escaping it. The voice was in his head, and the sea was all around him. The water was everywhere. It wasn't just an ocean or a river or a lake. It was inside him. Luke's feet carried him toward the pier. He wasn't sure how he ended up there, but as he reached the edge, standing just above the rocks, the sea stretching out before him in all its infinite blackness, he felt the pull again, the call, the voice. "Come to me, Luke." He tried to breathe, tried to steady himself, but his body was moving on its own now, the edge of the pier, just inches away, the jagged rocks below, too close, too real, too ready to welcome him. And then there it was, a figure in the water. It wasn't clear at first, just a shadow in the waves, an indistinct blur. But then it became clearer. And for a moment, Luke could have sworn he saw something, someone floating just below the surface, watching him. The voice came again, but this time it was different. This time it was clearer, more urgent. "Come back, Luke, your mind, come back to me." He couldn't fight it anymore. It was like a magnetic force, drawing him in, pulling him closer to the edge. He stepped forward, one foot in front of the other, his body moving against his will, toward the water, toward the darkness, toward the waiting. "Come back." The voice whispered his name one last time, and the world tilted, spinning, tilting like the ocean had begun to swallow the earth itself. Everything blurred. He reached out toward the edge, toward the water, his body moving faster now, unable to stop, like the sea had already claimed him. And as his feet left the edge of the pier, falling into the cold, dark abyss, a single thought lingered in his mind. He wasn't drowning, not yet, but he was going to. The cold hit him first. It wasn't the splash of water, the feeling of his body sinking that disoriented him. Number, the cold was different, unnatural. It sank into his bones, hollowed out his chest, twisted around his lungs like the fingers of some ancient creature trying to squeeze the life out of him. It wasn't just the sea, it was something else, something that lurked beneath. Luke couldn't breathe. His chest constricted as he fell, his arms flailing through the thick black water, trying to find something solid, something to hold on to. But there was nothing. Just the water, just the pull, the relentless tug dragging him deeper and deeper into the darkness. He tried to scream, but the salt water poured into his mouth, flooding his throat, choking him. His eyes burned, and he could barely see anything in the thick murk of the ocean around him. His limbs felt like lead, his body a dead weight sinking into the black void. But it wasn't the water that terrified him most. Number. It was the voice. Luke! It came to him, curling around him like smoke, soft and urgent, insistent in its call. The voice was clearer now, too real to be a dream, too sharp to be a trick of the mind. It was calling him, pulling him further into the depths. "Come back to me." The words were like an anchor pulling him down, down into the unknown. He wanted to fight it. He wanted to scream, to swim, to reach the surface. But his arms were too tired, his body too weak. And the pull, God, the pull was getting stronger. The voice was everywhere. It was in his mind, in his heart, in the water itself. "Come back, Luke, come back." He kicked, but it didn't matter. His legs refused to move the way they should, too sluggish, too slow, as if the water was thickening around him, wrapping itself around his muscles like chains. The darkness felt alive. It was more than just the absence of light. It was something aware, something that had been waiting for him. The deeper he sank, the more the air around him seemed to shift. He felt eyes, cold, unblinking eyes on him, watching, waiting. His mind spiraled as the water pressed in, the weight of it too much to bear. He could feel the pressure building, the ocean squeezing him, swallowing him whole. The voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was louder. It was clear. "You never left." Luke's heart stopped. His breath caught in his chest. The voice was no longer distant. It was coming from within him, from beneath him. The thing that had been calling to him wasn't just in the water. It had always been there, lurking in the dark corners of his mind, waiting for the right moment to reach out and drag him back. "Come back. You were never meant to leave." The words cut through him, slicing into his skin like knives, tearing at his very soul. His heart pounded in his chest as his thoughts spun. "I survived. I made it out. I was rescued. I didn't die." But the truth, the undeniable truth that slammed into him like a freight train, was this. He hadn't escaped. He wasn't free. Not really. The ocean had marked him. He could feel it now more than ever, the presence beneath the water, the weight of it pressing against him, a force that was bigger than anything he had ever known. It wasn't just a memory, it wasn't just the trauma of what had happened. Number, the ocean was alive, it was aware of him, and it was hungry. Come back. Luke's body moved of its own accord. He didn't even have the strength to fight it anymore. His muscles locked up, the water wrapping itself around him like a second skin, pulling him deeper, deeper into the abyss. The pressure was unbearable, his vision blurring as the cold seeped into his bones, the darkness swallowing him whole. His lungs screamed for air, but there was no air. There was only the cold, the dark. Come back to me. The voice echoed through him, reverberating inside his skull, shaking his very bones. He tried to scream, to fight back, but his body was betraying him. His arms and legs were stiff, his movements sluggish and weak, and all the while the voice was growing louder, more insistent. And then, in the crushing dark, he saw it, a shape, a shadow. It was barely perceptible at first, just a flicker at the edges of his vision, but as he sank deeper, the shape became clearer, more solid. It was a figure, a man, no, not a man, a thing, a silhouette, dark and terrible, its outline jagged, like it had been drawn in ink, sharp against the blackness of the water. Luke's heart froze in his chest. The figure was moving. It was coming toward him. Come back, Luke. Come back to me. He tried to move. He tried to turn away. His instincts screamed at him to swim, to fight, to get back to the surface, but his body refused to respond. It was as though the ocean had wrapped itself around him like a shroud, dragging him into its depths. The figure grew closer, its shape becoming more defined, and Luke could see it now, the face. It was his face, but not like he remembered it. It was twisted, distorted, eyes wide open, hollow. The skin was pale, mottled, as if the ocean itself had started to consume it. The lips were stretched in an eerie grin, too wide, too unnatural, a grin that was both comforting and terrifying all at once. And then, as the figure moved closer, Luke saw the eyes, his own eyes, staring back at him, but they weren't his anymore. They were dead, empty, hollow. And then the voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't from the figure, it was from everywhere. It filled the water, the space around him, and the cold rushed in again. Come back, Luke, you're not done yet. You never were. The figure reached out to him, a skeletal hand stretching toward him, fingers twitching, beckoning. Luke's breath caught in his throat. The pull, the weight of it, was unbearable. The voice was no longer just calling. It was commanding. Come back to me. You can't escape. Not now, not ever. And then, as the cold, clammy fingers brushed against his skin, everything went black. The world was black. Not the kind of black that came with sleep, with peaceful oblivion. No, this was a suffocating black, a wet, crushing black that pressed against him from every side. The water was thick like syrup, and it closed over him like a lid, sealing him into this tomb of cold and silence. His chest felt as though it was being crushed, his lungs on fire, struggling for a breath that wouldn't come. His heart pounded in his chest, but it didn't matter. The deeper he sank, the further his body seemed to drift from the surface, from reality. His arms felt like they were made of stone, too heavy to lift, too tired to fight. His legs were the same, limbs that once moved with the grace of a man who had survived, but now they were only weights, dragging him deeper. Come back. The voice. It came again, a murmur in the darkness, a familiar whisper that clung to him like the water itself. It was the same voice he'd heard since the accident, the same low, urgent tone that seemed to wrap itself around him like an invisible chain. It was his own voice, but not his. It wasn't a memory, a figment of his imagination. It was coming from inside him, a call from the past, or was it from the future? He couldn't tell anymore. "Come back to me." He felt a tug in his chest, an almost magnetic pull toward the sound of the voice. It wasn't just a plea, it was a command, and something deep inside him, some primal instinct, made him want to listen, made him want to go to it. But that was wrong. He had escaped. He had survived. He had to survive. Come back. He opened his eyes, or he thought he did. It was hard to tell in this murky world of water and dark, but he thought he could see something. Something moving, something watching him. Not the shadow of the thing he had seen before. No, this was different. This was real. "Come back, Luke. You can't escape me." The words echoed in his head, each syllable a blow to his sanity, a hammer to his soul. His body jerked, his heart twisted in pain, but still he couldn't move. The water was thick, almost suffocating, and his mind kept slipping further away. His thoughts were like the bubbles that rose from his mouth, gone in an instant, lost to the depths. He felt it again, the pressure. But this time it wasn't just the water. This was something else, something that was pulling at his skin, at his bones, at the very marrow of his soul. The voice was everywhere, filling him, filling his mind, and it felt like the ocean itself was reaching inside him, digging into him, clawing at him. "Luke, you're mine now." The voice was different now, darker, a promise, a demand. It had changed, and with it, so had the water around him. It was colder, thicker, as though it had turned into something else. Something alive, something hungry. He struggled, his arms moved, his legs kicked, but it didn't matter. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't move fast enough. The pressure kept building, the voice kept growing louder, and the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. And then, just as he thought he might finally lose his grip on everything, his consciousness, his breath, his very existence, he saw it. A face. It was floating before him, distorted like a reflection in dirty glass. It was unmistakable. His face, not the face that he knew, not the one that stared back at him in the mirror. This was something worse. The skin was pallid, almost translucent, stretched tight across the skull, and the eyes were wrong. They were wide open, unblinking, staring straight into his soul. The pupils were gone, replaced with empty, black voids that seemed to reach into him. He wanted to scream, but the water kept rushing in, choking him, filling his throat, stealing his breath away. The figure drifted closer. The face, his face, moved toward him, and Luke felt his heart stop. The black voids of the eyes seemed to pull him in, like the void of space itself, empty and suffocating, and the voice, no, the presence, that had been calling him, spoke again. "Come back, Luke. Come back to me." The words reverberated through his chest, through his mind, through his very bones, as though the sea itself was speaking them. Luke's body convulsed, his chest heaved, his limbs fought against the suffocating weight of the water. But it was no use. He was drowning. He was already in the process of drowning, the ocean around him, a never-ending grip on his body, and the voice. It was inside him now. He could feel it, deep in his chest, pulling at his very essence, twisting him into something else. You can't escape. The figure, his face, was inches from him now, and in that moment Luke understood. He understood everything, the accident, the drowning, the voice. It had been there all along. It had always been part of him. He had never truly left the water. The ocean had taken him once, and now it was coming for him again. The figure reached out, its cold hand brushing against his cheek. The touch was like ice, but it wasn't the water that froze him. It was the touch itself, the feeling of something dead, something empty, reaching for him. "You will come back." Luke tried to scream, tried to fight, but his limbs were no longer his own. They were numb. The water, the figure, the voice, all of it had become a part of him now. He was sinking deeper, deeper into the abyss, into the dark water that called to him, into the truth he had been fighting to deny. And as the figure's hand wrapped around his wrist, pulling him into the deep, Luke understood the cruel irony of it all. He was never meant to survive. The sea had always claimed him, and now it was going to keep him forever. Luke wasn't drowning anymore. No, not drowning. Drowning implied something that could end, something that could be survived. What he was doing, what he was experiencing now, had no end, no salvation. It was more like being swallowed, consumed by something so vast and cold and empty that it never even bothered to look back. He wasn't dying. He was just becoming. The cold had taken over his skin, seeping through every pore, replacing the warmth of life with something darker. His limbs were frozen in place, his arms and legs heavy and unyielding. The weight of the ocean, the weight of the truths, pressed on him from all sides. He couldn't move, he couldn't speak, he couldn't even think, not clearly, not fully. The ocean had erased everything except the call. Come back. That was all there was. A voice, a whisper, a pull, so deep it left him hollow. Hollow like the thing, the face, that had reached out to him. And like the black voids in its eyes, it wasn't his face anymore. Not exactly. Not in the way he thought it was. It had become something else, something worse. The figure, his face, was a part of him now, a grotesque reflection that twisted in his mind. He could still see it in his mind's eye, that pale, swollen face, those empty, soulless eyes. It didn't blink, they never blinked. They were always staring, always watching. The thing, whatever it was, had merged with him. It had always been a part of him. It wasn't some random soul that had died beside him. It wasn't just some random victim of the sea. It was him, and it was the ocean. The truth, the cold, crushing truth, was that Luke had never truly been saved. Not by the rescue crew, not by the doctors. He hadn't escaped the water that day. It had claimed him. And now, as he sank deeper, deeper into the pull of the dark, murky depths, Luke could feel it. It was calling to him, calling him back, pulling him toward the abyss, pulling him toward something he didn't understand, something that didn't want to be understood. It wanted to consume him. It wanted to take him. Cold crept up his neck, into his chest, past his ribs, wrapping around his heart, squeezing it. He could feel his pulse, weak and slow, but it was there, fading, dying. And the voice, God, the voice was louder now, filling the space, filling his chest, filling his very bones. You will come back. The voice wasn't distant anymore. It was inside him, inside his mind, inside the marrow of his bones. It was like a blood, like something that lived in him, fed on him from the inside out. And he couldn't deny it. He couldn't run from it. It had him. It had always had him. And then, as his mind began to fold in on itself, as the last bit of air that remained in his lungs began to slip away, Luke felt the hands again. They were cold, damp fingers, wrapping around his arms, his shoulders, and his neck, dragging him deeper still. But this time, he didn't fight them. He couldn't. The hands weren't human. They were like the ocean itself, creatures of salt and decay, fingers that had no end, no beginning. They didn't belong to anything, and they weren't pulling him down to the ocean floor. They were pulling him inward, deeper, into the heart of the ocean, into the heart of something alive, something vast, something ancient. The thing inside him, the voice, the face, was no longer separate. It had become one with him. He could feel it, its coldness, its hunger, moving through him like a poison, a venom that spread until it was all he knew, until it filled him completely, until he was nothing, but the ocean itself. His body jerked, his muscles spasmed. He opened his eyes, and saw nothing but the darkness around him. The water wasn't just water anymore, it had become him, and he had become it. The pull, the voice, it was all one thing, one being. Luke. The voice echoed again, a whisper, but it didn't come from outside him. It came from the depths. It came from everywhere. He wanted to scream, he wanted to shout out, to fight it, to run, but there was no escape. The ocean had him now, and the face, his face, was closer than ever, looming in the darkness, its eyes still wide and empty, waiting. "Luke, come back to me." And just as the darkness enveloped him completely, just as the last breath left his lungs, Luke understood. The ocean had never let him go. The voice was not from the past. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't even a warning. It was a promise that the ocean would never let him escape. The wind howled over the jagged cliffs, biting through his coat, and the sea below crashed against the rocks with a ferocity that echoed in his chest. There was something unnatural about the storm, like it had been waiting for him. He stood at the edge of the dock, squinting into the darkness, as the small, weather-beaten boat he had arrived on slowly drifted away, the captain already turning back toward the mainland. Alone now, he was on his own, just as he had been told. Mere miles from the coast of that forgotten stretch of land, where the tides churned in a ceaseless, lonely dance, stood the lighthouse. He had seen it from a distance, the stone tower jutting up against the sky like a sickly finger pointing toward the heavens. It wasn't much to look at. The lighthouse had been abandoned for years, and it was clear by its appearance that time had not been kind to it. The tower was cracked and chipped, its once bright white paint dulled by salt and decay. The small keeper's house beside it was little more than a silhouette in the fog, the windows dark and empty. As he made his way along the narrow, weathered path that led from the dock, he felt an odd sense of foreboding. It wasn't a fear he could name, not exactly, but it was there, coiled around the pit of his stomach like a thick rope, tightening as he drew closer. The island felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, or waiting for someone to come, as it had been for so many years now. The air was thick with the scent of salt and mildew, and the wind seemed to whistle through the cracks in the keeper's house, giving the entire place the feel of something that was dead, but hadn't realized it yet. This place, this damned lighthouse, was waiting. He could feel it in his bones. He had come to the island in search of something. What exactly, he wasn't sure. Maybe it was a fresh start. Maybe it was a way to escape the lingering guilt that had followed him for years. But deep down, there was something else. A sense of being chosen, of being needed. It had been a strange letter from a man whose name he didn't recognize that had offered him the job. Caretaker of the lighthouse, it had said. The pay wasn't much, but the solitude, the quiet, that was the real appeal. He stepped onto the porch of the keeper's house and hesitated before opening the door. It creaked on its hinges, the smell of damp wood and dust flooding his senses. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but this wasn't it. The furniture was sparse and covered in layers of dust, like it hadn't been touched in years. The only signs of life were the faint traces of footprints on the floor, leading to a narrow staircase that wound up into the belly of the lighthouse. The first night was always the hardest. He knew this, had prepared himself for it. The quiet, the isolation. The way the night could stretch on forever, when there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the sea for company. He had always been a solitary man, preferring the company of his own thoughts to that of others. But as the night drew in, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. something watching. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a distant comfort. The small room was lit only by the flickering light, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like living things. He stared at the fire for a long time, listening to the storm raging outside. His eyes kept drifting toward the window, where the lighthouse stood like a towering sentinel, its light blinking at intervals through the darkness. The beam swept over the landscape, its glow barely visible through the torrential rain. It wasn't long before he heard it, a low, guttural sound like a voice calling his name. The sound came from the tower, from the upper levels of the lighthouse. It was distant at first, muffled by the storm, but unmistakable. The voice, if it was a voice, carried with it an odd familiarity, as if he had heard it before, but from a great distance. At first, he dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps the house settling, but it came again, this time more insistent. The voice was unmistakably human. His pulse quickened, his heart pounding in his chest. The wind outside howled louder, but it wasn't the wind. No, this was something different. This was something that shouldn't be there. He rose from his chair, his body moving on instinct, though every fibre of his being screamed at him to stay still. The voice was calling him again, and this time it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, closer. It was as though the voice had been waiting for him to come. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm, to stay level-headed, but there was something in that voice, something desperate and pleading, twisted his insides with unease. He knew he shouldn't go. He knew it didn't make sense, but the pull, the instinct, was too strong. He grabbed his coat and moved toward the door. The wind greeted him like an old enemy, pushing against him as if it were trying to prevent him from leaving. He shoved against it and walked toward the lighthouse, the ground slick and treacherous beneath his boots. The air seemed to grow colder as he approached, the storm intensifying, as if the very earth itself was reacting to his decision. The lighthouse loomed before him, dark and silent. The door to the tower was ajar, swaying gently in the wind. He pushed it open and stepped inside, the door creaking on its hinges like an old man groaning with age. The scent of mildew and salt water was thick in the air, and the wooden floorboards creaked under his weight. The spiral staircase he went, his footsteps heavy and slow, the wind howling through the cracks in the tower. The voice grew louder the higher he climbed, more distinct now, though still faint and eerie. It was almost pleading. A cry for help? Or was it something else? Something far worse. As he reached the top of the tower, the last step echoing in the silence, he was met with a sight that stopped him cold. The lantern room was empty. No one stood there. No one waited. The storm howled outside, but inside the tower was silent, save for the wind that rattled the windows. The beam of the lighthouse swept across the jagged rocks below, but there was no sign of the person who had been calling him. He turned, his mind spinning, trying to make sense of it all. Had he imagined it? Was it just the storm playing tricks on him? His heart was pounding now, his breath coming in short gasps. It didn't make sense. The voice had been so real, so clear. He was about to turn to leave when he heard it again. This time, it was right behind him. The voice was low, guttural, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "You're too late," it said. And then, there was nothing. The wind stopped howling. The storm ceased. The world went eerily still. For a long moment he stood there in the silence, his breath catching in his throat. The lighthouse had stopped turning. The sea outside seemed to have gone deathly quiet, as though the world itself had been holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Something was wrong. And now he knew for certain. He was not alone. The world outside the tower had fallen eerily silent. The wind, which had been a constant companion since his arrival, had simply stopped. The crashing waves that once pounded against the jagged rocks below now sounded like a distant memory, like something heard in a dream. Even the lighthouse beam had ceased its relentless sweep over the darkened landscape. It was as though time itself had been paused. He stood motionless in the lantern room, the stillness pressing against him like a heavy, suffocating weight. His heart was pounding, every beat ringing in his ears, and for a moment he wondered if the voice he had heard, the one that had called to him from the tower, had been nothing more than a figment of his imagination, a product of the isolation and the storm. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. The voice had been real. He'd felt it. It had been a low, guttural sound that vibrated in his chest, calling him, urging him to come closer. And now it was gone, vanished as quickly as it had come. But the air was still thick with tension, and something he couldn't name, was waiting. Slowly he turned to face the spiral staircase that led back down to the base of the tower. His feet felt heavy, as though they didn't want to leave the top of the tower. But he forced himself to move, step by slow step, his breath shallow, his pulse quickening with every creak of the wooden floor beneath him. Each step felt like it was drawing him deeper into something he didn't fully understand, something darker than he was prepared for. As he descended, the silence became more oppressive, the darkness deeper, as if the walls themselves were closing in around him. He reached the ground floor of the tower, and the door to the lantern room creaked closed behind him, sealing him in. The house, a short walk away, was still visible in the distance, a small shape in the fog. It felt like hours had passed, but the night remained unbroken, as though the storm had somehow held its breath. He felt disoriented, like he had stepped out of time. But something in the air had changed. There was a coldness now, not from the wind, but something that had settled in his bones, a chill that made his skin crawl. He had to get back to the house, back to where he had some semblance of control. As he made his way across the path, the wind suddenly picked up again, though it wasn't the storm's wild fury. No, this was different. This wind was deliberate. It tugged at him like invisible hands brushing his shoulders, pulling him forward with increasing urgency. He quickened his pace, his breath coming in shallow gasps, the weight of the island pressing on him, the very earth beneath his boots seeming to vibrate with an unsettling hum. And then, as though a door had opened in the dark, the voice came again. But this time it was clearer, louder, more distinct. "You shouldn't be here," the voice growled, low and cracked, as though it were coming from the bowels of the earth itself. He froze. His heart leapt into his throat. He turned around, scanning the darkened lighthouse behind him, but saw nothing. The beams of the lighthouse were still and lifeless. The door to the tower was closed, but a thick sense of presence lingered, hanging in the air like fog. "Go back," the voice urged again, its tone more desperate now, but there was something else, something far more chilling in the way it spoke. There was a sickly sweetness to it, like the voice of someone who had been lost for far too long, someone who had been waiting for company. "I'm just here to do my job," he said, more to himself than anything, his voice shaking as the words left his lips. But there was no response. The wind howled again, and for a moment he thought he had imagined it all. But deep in his gut he knew better. He reached the house and stepped inside, slamming the door behind him with a force that echoed through the empty rooms. The quiet of the house was an unsettling contrast to the storm outside. Inside, the hearth crackled softly, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. The room felt almost too warm, too safe, a cocoon from the madness of the night outside. But there was a tension in the air that the fire couldn't dispel. It clung to him like a second skin. He leaned against the wooden door, his hand pressed against the cool surface, trying to steady his breathing. The firelight danced in his eyes, but the flickering shadows on the walls seemed to move of their own accord, stretching and bending in unnatural ways. They didn't follow the rhythm of the flames. They moved too fast, too erratically, like they had minds of their own. He turned away from the door, unable to shake the feeling that something was behind him, watching him, waiting. The shadows deepened in the corners of the room, gathering like a cloud before a storm. His throat tightened, his breath catching in his chest as he stepped toward the small kitchen. He needed to eat something, to ground himself in something familiar, but the air in the room felt wrong. Wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. He glanced back toward the window. The lighthouse was just a dark silhouette in the distance. The beam of light still hadn't resumed its sweep. It was as though the island was holding its breath. Then a sudden noise, the sound of footsteps, not outside, inside. They were slow at first, like someone testing the floorboards. Then they grew louder, more deliberate. The sound came from the hallway leading to the staircase. His heart stopped. "Who's there?" he called, his voice sharp, demanding. His throat felt dry, his words tasting like ash in his mouth. But the only answer was the sound of those footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving closer. Slowly. His instinct screamed at him to run, to flee the house and the island, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by something deeper than fear, an ancient, primal terror that crawled beneath his skin, into his bones. Then the voice again, "You came too late." It wasn't coming from the staircase now. No, it was coming from the very walls themselves, seeping through the cracks, curling into his ears like tendrils of smoke. The footsteps stopped, and then, with a slow, drawn-out creak, the door to the lighthouse tower swung open. The door to the lighthouse tower creaked open with a sound that felt like it was breaking something fragile, something that had been untouched for years. The room stood silent for a long moment after, the air thick and still. But there was no mistaking it now. The house was no longer quiet. The storm outside had resumed its fury. Something far worse was stirring within. He felt the ground beneath him shift, as if the entire house had tilted ever so slightly, the weight of it dragging him toward the tower. His throat tightened, and he swallowed hard, but the air felt thick, almost impossible to breathe. The footsteps had stopped, but the voice that had haunted him since his arrival, lingered. It was more than a voice now. It had become a presence, an oppressive force that seemed to fill the space, pushing against the walls, filling his lungs, choking him with its weight. "You came too late," it whispered again, and this time it was not coming from the walls, but from directly behind him. He spun around, his body stiff with fear, his heart hammering in his chest. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls, but no one was there. The room was empty, but he wasn't alone. He could feel it in every inch of his skin. The presence was there, right behind him, watching him, waiting. His eyes darted to the door of the lighthouse tower, which still stood ajar, the darkness beyond it stretching like an open mouth, beckoning him. He had no choice. He had to go. The air in the house had become unbearable, the weight of the darkness in the room crushing him from all sides. The only thing he could do now was confront whatever waited for him at the top of that tower. With trembling hands, he pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, his steps heavy as he walked toward the door. Each step seemed to echo in the silence, louder than it should have been. like the house itself was amplifying his fear. The wind howled outside, but there was a strange stillness in the air. The storm no longer seemed like an external force. It had become part of the island itself, part of the land, the house, the tower. He stepped into the darkness of the tower, and the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. He flinched, his breath catching in his throat, and in that moment he realized the truth. He wasn't supposed to be here. None of it was meant for him. This place, this lighthouse, it was never meant to be disturbed. The island had been waiting, but not for him. The voice had not called to him by mistake. It had been waiting for someone, yes, but it wasn't him. He started up the spiral staircase again, his feet feeling as if they were moving through molasses. The darkness around him pressed in, the shadows shifting and bending as he climbed higher, every turn of the stairs bringing him closer to something he wasn't prepared to face. His breath was ragged now, his heart hammering with each step. But there was no turning back. The voice came again, this time stronger, clearer. It didn't whisper. It spoke as though it had a purpose, a command. "You're too late," it said. "The light is dead, and so are you." The words crawled across his skin, each syllable sinking into his bones, tightening like chains around his chest. His hands gripped the iron railing of the staircase so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He could feel the tower vibrating, humming with some unseen force, and it seemed to pulse beneath his feet as he climbed higher. As he neared the top, the storm outside had reached its peak. The wind shrieked through the cracks in the tower, tearing at the walls, throwing rain against the windows with such force that he could barely see through the glass. But despite the chaos outside, there was an unnatural stillness inside. The wind had become muted, as though it couldn't touch the tower anymore. The very air seemed to be holding its breath. When he finally reached the top, he stepped into the lantern room, his legs shaky beneath him. The beam of light that should have been sweeping the coastline was gone. The great lamp was dark. The room was cold, the stone floor damp from the sea spray that had seeped in through the cracks. And there, in the center of the room, was the source of the voice. It was a man, no, not a man, a figure. A hollowed-out shell of a man, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones, his eyes wide and vacant. His hair, long and matted, hung down in clumps around his face. But it was his mouth, his gaping mouth, that drew the most attention. It wasn't human. It was stretched too wide, cracked open like a wound that had never healed. He was staring at the man now, the caretaker, but there was nothing in his eyes, nothing but emptiness, and yet the voice that had haunted him all night, came from those lips. "You've come to take my place," it rasped, the voice hoarse and raw, like it hadn't been used in years. "No," the man whispered, his voice cracking. "No, I didn't. I didn't come for that. I'm just here to do my job." But the figure only tilted its head, its mouth stretching wider, the sound of its broken laughter filling the room. The air around them grew thick, suffocating, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble. "You don't understand," the figure said, its voice now more of a growl than words. "The light doesn't just guide ships, it keeps them. It keeps all of us. It keeps the dead." He backed away from the figure, his legs feeling weak beneath him, but there was nowhere to go. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in on him. The figure took a step forward, its head jerking to one side with a sickening crack. Its eyes locked onto him, and he could see it now, the emptiness that lingered in its hollow gaze. "You can never leave," it said, its voice laced with venom, "because you're already dead." The words pierced him like a knife, and suddenly the tower seemed to collapse inward on itself. The light that had once guided sailors now seemed to be suffocating him, closing in around him, the walls pressed against him, the air growing thick with the stench of rot and decay. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the voice stopped. The figure stood frozen, its eyes still locked onto his, but there was no more sound. For a long moment he stood there, unsure of what was real anymore. Was it the storm that had driven him mad? Had he simply imagined the figure? Or was it something far worse? The answer, he realized, was already too late. He had come to the island, and now he was part of it. A part of the curse that had kept this lighthouse alive for so long. The light, dead. The keeper, lost. And now he was the one who would keep it. The stillness in the room grew unbearable. The storm outside had lost its fury, but the weight of the silence inside the lighthouse was something far worse. It was a kind of stillness that seeped into the bones, into the marrow, like the pause before a scream. And then a low moan. It came from deep within the bowels of the lighthouse, a sound that seemed to echo from the very foundations of the tower, vibrating through the stone and into his bones. It wasn't a sound of pain. This was something worse. It was the sound of longing, a kind of insatiable hunger that had not been fed in years. The figure, the keeper, spoke again, its voice even quieter this time, as though it was drawing close, as though it was standing right beside him. Do you hear it? Can you feel it? The hunger? It calls to you now. It's calling your name. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the sound, but it was everywhere. In his ears, in his mind, crawling beneath his skin. It filled the room, consumed the air. The wind outside picked up again, roaring through the cracks in the tower, but it wasn't the wind that frightened him. No, it was the presence. The way the air seemed to grow thick with a promise. The promise of something old, something hungry. He took a step backward, and his foot caught on the edge of the stone floor. He stumbled, his body lurching toward the center of the room, his hands reaching out for something, anything to stop his fall. But before he could regain his balance, the figure was upon him. It moved faster than he could comprehend, its long, gnarled fingers reaching out, grasping his wrist with a force that was bone-crushing. It pulled him close, its breath cold on his face, and its eyes, the eyes that had once been human, were now wide and hollow, empty pits of darkness. You belong to it now, the keeper hissed. You belong to the lighthouse, to the light, to the curse. The words were sharp as knives, cutting through his thoughts, slicing through his fear. He tried to pull away, but the keeper's grip was unyielding, the fingers wrapped around his wrist like iron. There was no escape. Then with a sickening lurch, the keeper dragged him forward, pulling him toward the center of the room, toward the open hatch that led to the base of the tower. "No, I'm not," he tried to say, but his voice faltered, lost in the grip of terror that had now consumed him. The keeper smiled, or at least it tried to. The lips pulled back, stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Teeth that should not have belonged to a man. The smile was wrong. It was a smile that belonged to something far older, far darker. "We all belong here," the keeper said, its voice now an amalgamation of despair and hunger. "Even the dead. And once you're here, you never leave. Not until the light calls." The darkness pressed in tighter like a heavy curtain that obscured everything around him. The walls blurred, the shadows stretching like monstrous fingers reaching out from every corner. He felt his legs give out beneath him, his body sinking into the floor, swallowed by the darkness. And then, as though from the depths of the earth, the light came back. But it wasn't the same light. No, this light was different. It wasn't a beam that guided ships across rocky shores. This light was a blinding, suffocating force, cold and sharp. It poured out of the lighthouse's lantern, flooding the room in a brilliant white that consumed everything. The keeper's figure seemed to flicker and distort in the light, like a shadow unable to keep its form. The voice, no, the presence, spoke one final time. The light never forgets. The tower groaned, its ancient stone walls cracking as if they were being torn apart from within. The light pulsed, blinding, overwhelming, as if it were alive and hungry. The floor beneath him began to crack, fissures spreading outward, as if the lighthouse itself was a wound, and the light was its poison. And then, as the tower seemed to collapse inward, he understood. He wasn't the new keeper, he was the next meal. The lighthouse was no longer just a structure of stone and iron. It was alive, its heart beating in rhythm with the storm outside, its pulse echoing through the very earth beneath it. The floor beneath him cracked open like a wound, and he felt himself falling deeper into the light. It wasn't a fall in the way you might imagine. It wasn't a free fall through space or time. It was more like being drawn, sucked downward into something dark and endless. His limbs felt weightless, yet the pressure around him grew unbearable. The light, the blinding, suffocating light, engulfed everything. It filled his lungs, burned through his eyes, crawled into his skin, into his blood. And in that moment, he understood that this was it. There would be no escape. The keeper's voice, once filled with hunger and malice, now seemed to come from every direction. It wasn't just words. It was a part of the light, a part of the curse, an inescapable, eternal force. "You're part of it now," the voice whispered, though the figure had long since disappeared. "The lighthouse calls." He reached out with his hands, trying to grasp onto something solid, anything to hold him, but there was nothing. The walls of the tower had dissolved, the floor had vanished, and all that was left was the light, swallowing him whole. Then, in the midst of the endless white, he saw it. A shape, a shadow against the blinding glow. A figure, no, not just one figure, many. They were there, all around him, drifting in the light like shadows from a forgotten dream. They were the lost ones. The ones who had come before him. The ones who had been swallowed by the lighthouse, doomed to remain there forever. He saw their faces, their hollow eyes staring back at him, their mouths twisted in silent screams. They were the former keepers, the ones who had once been like him, human, alive, full of breath, but who had become part of the tower, part of the curse, a never-ending cycle of light and death. And in their eyes he saw the truth. He wasn't the first, he wouldn't be the last. The light. It wasn't just a guide for ships lost in the storm. It wasn't a beacon of hope. It was something far darker, far older. It was a trap, a lure that called to the lost, the desperate, the lonely. And once you answered, there was no turning back. "You are the light now," the voice whispered again, its tone no longer filled with malice, but with a terrible finality. "You'll keep it. You'll keep them." The words sank into his chest like a weight. The truth was inescapable, and he felt the final threads of his humanity begin to unravel like paper torn in the wind. He was no longer a man, no longer a keeper. He was something else now, a part of the light, a part of the curse. The figures around him began to move, drifting toward him like ghosts, their limbs stiff and jerking, as if they were still trying to fight the weight of their fate, even after all these years. Their hands reached out to him, their eyes begging for release, for escape. But there was none. There would be none for him either. "You were always meant to join us," the voice whispered one last time, the sound echoing through him like a sickening lullaby. The light calls and you answer. The tower around him began to reform, the stone and iron walls materializing from the light, solidifying around him like a cage. He felt the weight of it press against him, but there was nothing he could do. His body, once his own, had become part of the lighthouse. His soul, now bound to the tower, would never leave. As the light flickered, it began to pulse, rhythmic and steady like a heartbeat, slow at first, but then faster, louder, growing stronger. The figures moved in time with the pulse, circling him now like a silent procession of ghosts. Their faces were blank, empty, like the light had consumed all that was once human inside them, leaving nothing but hollow shells. And then, from the depths of the tower, from the very heart of the light, the voice called again. There is no end. The lighthouse had claimed him, body and soul, and there was no escape, no release. The light would never go out, not for him, not for any of them. It would burn forever, consuming the keepers, the lost souls who had answered its call. And the island would remain. The storm would come and go, the waves would crash, and the lighthouse would stand tall against the night. The beam of light would shine out over the sea, but it would never guide again. It would never show the way. It would only call. It would only call, and the keeper, the last keeper, would wait. The letter came on a cold Wednesday morning, a thin slip of paper that carried with it a weight much heavier than its size suggested. Bethany Collins stood in the small kitchen of her apartment, the letter trembling slightly in her hands as the morning sun filtered through the grimy window. The coffee cup she had been holding lay forgotten on the counter, the steam rising from it dissipating into the dull air. It was from a lawyer. The type of letter that one would expect after a relative's death, a death she hadn't even known had occurred. She knew the name, an uncle, or at least that's what he had claimed to be when she was a child. She couldn't remember much about him, only faint, disturbing images from her youth. He had lived in a town far away, a place she couldn't even recall now, and his visits had been sporadic, uncomfortable. The man always smelled faintly of dust and something else, something sharper, like the faint tang of burnt wood. Now, apparently, she had inherited something, an old theatre. The words on the page were clear and official. It was hers, all hers. No mention of why, no mention of what had become of the man who had owned it. The only clue was the name of the theatre, the Marionette Playhouse. The lawyer's letter offered no consolation. The man, a Mr. Richard Hale, had passed away in his sleep, they said, and with his death came a legacy. She was to take ownership of the building immediately, as there were no other heirs. Bethany folded the letter carefully and placed it on the counter, her fingers pressing into it, as if she could feel some lingering connection to this unknown uncle through the thick paper. The letter had told her little else about the condition of the theatre, except that it was in a remote part of town, an area that had been largely abandoned after a fire had gutted the surrounding streets decades ago. For reasons she couldn't explain, a chill settled over her, gnawing at her insides. But when the opportunity for something new, something unknown, arose, a part of her had always been drawn to it. This wasn't just an inheritance of property. It felt like an invitation to something far more complex. The theatre was even worse than she had expected. The outside was wrapped in the weathered bones of a place long forgotten. There were no windows on the ground floor, only tall, narrow slots that looked like dark eyes peering into the street. A red and gold marquee hung above the door, its lettering faded beyond recognition, like a ghost of a memory from another time. The entire building seemed to exhale a musty, stale air, its very existence reluctant to remain standing in the face of time. The brick exterior was cracked and covered in years of grime. The place looked as though it might collapse any second, as if it had been abandoned for a century rather than a few decades. Bethany stood at the threshold for a moment, the cool breeze from the alleyway pushing at her back, urging her inside. There was something unsettling about the silence here, the kind of quiet that pressed in on you like a physical force, making every breath feel like a struggle. Finally, with a deep breath, she stepped inside. The smell hit her immediately. It wasn't just the scent of old wood and dust. It was a heavier, more suffocating stench, like something trapped in time, decaying in slow motion. The air was thick, musty with mildew, and the once grand foyer now felt more like a mausoleum. Faded velvet curtains hung in sagging folds from the walls, their deep crimson colour swallowed by years of dirt and neglect. The floors, once polished and gleaming, were now covered in a layer of grime, each step echoing in the hollow, cavernous room. Bethany had been expecting something dismal, but the sheer presence of it, the weight of its decay, was almost tangible. The place felt wrong. Not just old, not just neglected, but wrong. There was an undercurrent here, a sense of presence, like she was not alone. Her pulse quickened as she moved further inside, instinctively looking over her shoulder, as if expecting to see a shadow move where there shouldn't be one. Her footsteps carried her deeper into the theatre. She passed through the foyer and into the lobby, where ticket stubs and scraps of paper littered the floor like forgotten memories. There was a staircase in the back of the room leading to a darkened hallway, and as she stepped closer, the air grew even colder. On the far side of the lobby, behind a wrought iron gate, she saw what had been left behind, a collection of marionettes. They hung in a row, suspended from threads, dozens of them. Each one was frozen in a grotesque pose, their wooden bodies cracked and aged, their painted faces faded and chipped. But what struck her most was the way they seemed to stare, eyes wide and unblinking, watching, following her with a strange intensity. The puppets were arranged as if they were waiting for a performance that would never come. Bethany's hand instinctively reached for her throat. She had always hated puppets. The very idea of them, being controlled by invisible strings, had unsettled her as a child. She could still remember the old puppet shows her uncle had taken her to, the strange puppet master who would always take a little too much pleasure in making the puppets dance. Her uncle. There was something about this place, this collection, that felt personal, like she had stumbled into the middle of a nightmare that had been brewing long before she arrived. But the longer she stood there, the more she felt an inexplicable pull, something deep inside her, some forgotten thread beckoning her forward. Without thinking, she approached the gate. She leaned in closer, her eyes scanning the puppets one by one, her breath catching when she reached the one at the farthest end. It was a large figure, a marionette of a man with exaggerated features, long, gaunt face, large, hollow eyes, a twisted grin that seemed too wide. The puppet had been left in a strange pose, one hand raised, as though it were reaching for her. A sudden shiver raced up her spine. Without warning, the strings began to twitch. The movement was almost imperceptible at first, like the wind had caught them. But it was enough to make her pause, enough to make her blood run cold. She stepped back, a sharp gasp leaving her lips. No, it must have been the wind. She turned and hurried down the hallway, trying to push away the unsettling feeling that had settled in her chest. But the movement stayed with her, gnawing at her thoughts as she moved toward the back of the theatre, her footsteps growing faster, more frantic. The backstage area was no better. A small hallway led into a room cluttered with old costumes, faded curtains, and piles of rotting wood. There were more puppets here, their stringed limbs twisted at odd angles. But it wasn't the puppets that made her stop in her tracks. It was the sound, a whisper. At first, it was so faint that she almost convinced herself it was her imagination. But then again, louder now. "Come closer." Bethany froze. It was a voice, low, guttural, like it was coming from deep within the bowels of the theatre itself. She could feel it now, the weight of something in the air, the palpable sense of being watched, the sense that she was not alone. The puppets, they weren't just for show, were they? Number, they were waiting for her. They had been waiting for a long time, and in that moment Bethany knew with a sickening certainty that the puppets were not just made of wood and string. They were waiting to perform again. But this time, she was the one who would have to play her part. The whispers didn't stop. They were there, like a distant hum, like something buried deep in the earth, reverberating beneath the floors and through the thick walls of the old theatre. They tugged at her, insistent, pulling her attention back to the puppet room, back to the shadows where the marionettes waited. "Come closer." The voice was no longer just a whisper. It had grown louder, more insistent, as though it were calling her by name, coaxing her with an unseen hand. Every step she took toward the backstage area seemed to make it clearer, louder, impossible to ignore. Her heart thudded in her chest, but her feet, as though they were no longer her own, carried her forward. Bethany's fingers brushed against the cold, rusted doorknob that led into the puppet storage area. The same marionettes, their empty eyes still fixed in place, swayed ever so slightly. But it wasn't the puppets themselves that drew her attention now. Number It was the presence in the air, the thick, almost suffocating sense that she was not alone. Her breath caught in her throat and she took a step back, her pulse racing, only to find the whisper had grown into a command. "Come closer, or you will never leave." She froze. The words, though soft, were like ice. They seemed to slip under her skin, burrowing into her very soul. Something dark, something ancient was here, and it wanted her to perform. The sound of her breathing filled her ears, louder than the whispers, but it wasn't enough to drown them out. Slowly, against every instinct she had, she found herself stepping closer, reaching for the door again, turning the knob. The wood creaked like the groan of something old, reluctant to open, and then the door swung wide. The room beyond was darker than the rest of the theatre, as though the shadows had gathered here, gathered on purpose. The air was thick with dust, with the remnants of a time long past. The walls were lined with rows and rows of puppets, their wooden bodies faded, cracked, and chipped. Some were twisted in poses so unnatural they looked as though they had been caught mid-dance, their movements frozen in time, as though they had been abandoned, waiting for someone to take the strings once again. The marionette at the far end of the room, the one she had noticed earlier, the one with the twisted grin and hollow eyes, seemed to stare at her now more intently than before. Its strings, once still, now twitched, jerked. And in that moment, she understood. They weren't just puppets. They weren't just waiting. They were alive. Bethany's stomach twisted. Her head spun with the sudden realization. She should leave. She should turn around and run as fast as she could, out of this wretched place, out of this nightmare. But her body wouldn't obey her. The whispers in the room, those faint, seductive murmurs, wrapped themselves around her like a rope, pulling her closer. "You cannot leave, not yet, not until the show is ready." The voice was sharp now, commanding, sharp as a blade, and she knew it, somehow, without a doubt, that it wasn't a voice at all. It was the puppeteer. The one who had controlled these marionettes for decades, the one who had owned the theatre, the one whose presence lingered in the shadows like a malignant tumour, feeding off fear, off anticipation. Bethany's knees buckled slightly as she took another step forward. The puppets all swayed with her movement, as if they had somehow sensed her proximity, their strings rattling, creaking under the strain. And then she heard it. The faint scrape of wood, the sound of feet, small wooden feet, shuffling on the floor. She looked down, and the sight almost made her scream. The puppet, the one with the twisted grin, had moved. It wasn't much, but it was enough to chill her to the bone. The wooden foot had scraped against the floor, just a slight movement, but it was unmistakable. Bethany gasped, taking a step back, her heart racing. But then the other puppets began to move. Slowly at first, like the waking of something ancient, something that had lain dormant for far too long. A puppet in the back corner creaked to life, its wooden joints grinding as it took a stiff step forward. The one beside it followed. The strings pulled taut, jerking the wooden figures into life, the limbs moving in awkward, uncoordinated motions. And then the command came. Perform. The whisper was no longer just a whisper. It was a force, a command that filled her ears, vibrated through her body. The marionettes didn't wait. Their movements became frantic, wild. The sounds of their wooden bodies scraping against the floor, of their strings tightening and snapping, filled the room like a sickening symphony. The puppet with the twisted grin raised its hand toward her again, the fingers stretching out as if beckoning her forward. Bethany stumbled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. Her mind screamed at her to run, to leave, but her feet were frozen to the floor. Her body refused to obey her instincts. Perform, the voice hissed again. The air around her seemed to grow colder, the darkness more oppressive. She could feel the weight of it now, the suffocating pressure of the puppeteer's control. And then, as if on cue, the puppet stopped, all at once. The room was eerily still again, except for the faint sound of the strings swaying, a soft creak of wood. Bethany's heart was pounding in her chest, her breath shallow as she tried to steady herself, to understand what had just happened. She turned, her back pressed against the wall as she sought some kind of escape. But she knew there was no escape, not anymore. She'd felt it in her bones, in the very marrow of her being. The theatre was alive. And it wasn't just the puppets that were pulling the strings. It was something more. Something worse. Something that had been waiting. Her uncle's presence, the puppeteer himself. He wasn't gone. He was here in the dark corners of this decaying building, pulling at the strings of the past. And now those strings were tangled around her too. You will perform. The words weren't a plea. They weren't a request. They were a command. And as Bethany's feet finally began to move, she realized the truth with horrifying clarity. She wasn't just the audience anymore. She was part of the show. Bethany's hands were trembling as she backed away from the puppet room. The air in the theatre felt heavier now, as if something had shifted, as if the very walls had drawn closer to her, closing her in. Strings that had once been, still now seemed to stretch taut across the entire space, an invisible web suffocating her. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts as she stumbled backward through the dark corridor, her head spinning, her chest tight with fear. Her mind raced, each thought a jumbled mess, but one thing remained clear. She had to get out. She had to leave this place before it consumed her, before the marionettes, or worse, their puppeteer, decided to make her their next performance. But as she reached the front door, her hand trembling on the cold brass handle, she stopped. The whispers had returned, only this time they weren't faint or distant. They were here. They were all around her, swirling in the air like a thick fog, each syllable cutting through her skin. The walls seemed to hum with an electric energy, and the strings, those damnable strings, they were everywhere now, stretching across the doorway, hanging like cobwebs in the darkness. "You cannot leave," the voice growled, low and guttural. It sent a cold shiver down her spine, a chill that threatened to freeze her very blood. Bethany's fingers gripped the door handle tighter, panic rising in her throat, but the door refused to budge. She tried again, pulling with all her strength, but the wood didn't give. The puppet master's power was everywhere now, pulling at her very soul. "You will stay," the voice commanded, and she could feel the weight of it pressing against her chest, suffocating her. Bethany stumbled backward, gasping for air, her legs shaking beneath her as the strings seemed to close in. The darkness in the theatre was no longer just the absence of light. It was alive, swirling with a malevolent force, with the presence of something ancient and powerful. "Come to the stage," the voice urged, now softer, almost coaxing. She didn't want to go back to the stage. She didn't want to be anywhere near the marionettes or the puppeteer. But the strings pulled at her, each one a thread of power, of control, winding around her like a trap. The whispers grew louder, insistent, and she could feel them worming their way into her mind, filling her thoughts with images of things she didn't want to see. She could hear the faint scraping of wood behind her, another puppet moving. She turned, and her heart lurched into her throat. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was one of them, a marionette, its limbs jerking and twitching like something dead trying to walk. The wooden figure's eyes were fixed on her, its painted face twisted into a grin. Bethany didn't wait. She ran. Her footsteps echoed through the empty theatre, her heels slapping against the cold floor as she sprinted down the darkened hallway toward the stage. She could hear the scuttling behind her, the sound of the puppets coming to life, moving in unison, their wooden joints creaking with unnatural life. She reached the stage, breathing heavily, her chest tight as she skidded to a stop. The curtains, heavy and faded, loomed in front of her, and the stage lights, long extinguished, now flickered weakly above, casting eerie shadows across the empty seats in the auditorium. It was silent here, too silent, except for the soft thrum of something in the air, something watching her. The theatre itself seemed to breathe, and then she saw it. The puppet, the one with the twisted grin, the one that had started it all. It stood in the center of the stage, its wooden body creaking as it raised one gnarled hand toward her. "Perform," it whispered. She couldn't take her eyes off it. Its grin seemed to grow wider, the painted mouth stretching beyond what was natural until it was an open maw, ready to devour her. Bethany felt the pull again. It was irresistible, like the strings were wrapped around her heart, pulling her forward. She didn't want to move, but she couldn't help it. Her feet took slow, deliberate steps toward the puppet, her body no longer under her control. "You will perform," the voice whispered again, and this time it came not from the puppet, but from somewhere deep within the theatre, from all around her, as though the very walls were speaking. Bethany's heart raced in her chest, her body trembling. She didn't know what kind of performance it wanted, but she feared it wouldn't matter. She wouldn't have a choice. Not anymore. The lights flickered once more, and when they came back on, she saw something new, something terrible. The seats, the rows of empty chairs were now filled, but not with people, with more marionettes. They sat there, each one frozen in place, their hollow eyes staring at her, waiting for her to begin. The entire theatre was filled with them, sitting like an audience, their wooden bodies rigid, their strings pulled taut, their eyes fixed on her. And in the center of the stage, the twisted puppet with the wide grin was still waiting, its fingers twitching as if it were impatient, as if it had been waiting for far too long. Bethany's breath caught in her throat. "Begin," the voice hissed, now louder, more insistent. It was everywhere, suffocating her, drowning out her thoughts. The marionettes in the audience twitched, their heads tilting toward her, their strings tightening, and she could feel it. They were waiting for her. And just like that, it clicked. This wasn't a choice. The performance had already begun. The puppets were waiting for their puppet master, for their next command, but there was no one to control them. No one, except her. Bethany's legs felt weak, her hands shaking as she reached for the strings that hung above her, the dark, twisted threads that had ensnared her from the very beginning. It was a sickening realization, one that made her skin crawl, but she understood it now. She wasn't just in the theatre. She wasn't just a spectator. She was part of the show. She was a performer, a player, caught in the puppet master's game, and there was no escaping it. Her hands trembled as she pulled at the strings, unsure of what would happen next, unsure of what the puppets wanted from her. But as she moved, the other marionettes on stage began to move as well, their limbs jerked to life, their strings pulling them into strange, exaggerated positions. The twisted puppet with the grin stepped forward, its hand outstretched, its wooden body moving as if it were alive, as if it were waiting for her to play her part. "You are one of us now," the voice whispered, and as the marionettes continued to move, the air around her thickened, the theatre closing in as it swallowed her whole. She was no longer Bethany Collins. She was just another puppet. Bethany felt the strings pull at her, felt them twist inside her, as if they had become part of her very being, part of her flesh. She was no longer just a woman caught in a nightmare. She was a marionette, controlled by something beyond her understanding. The theatre around her seemed to pulse, a dark, living entity that hungered for more, its shadow stretching across every corner of the room, every inch of her mind. The marionettes in the audience watched her with their hollow, vacant eyes. There was no sympathy in their stares, no empathy. They were just waiting for her to perform. Her hands trembled as she reached for the strings, pulling them with jerky, uncoordinated movements. The twisted puppet with the wide grin, the one that had started it all, stepped closer, its wooden joints creaking, its painted face impossibly wide. Its fingers twitched as though it were waiting for her to make the next move. Bethany's body responded before her mind could catch up. Her arms jerked up, mimicking the puppet's motions, her feet sliding across the stage in an awkward dance. She wanted to scream, to tear herself free from this madness, but her mouth was dry, her throat tight. The words that had haunted her since her arrival in this god-forsaken theatre now played on a loop in her mind. Performance. She was trapped. Her body was no longer her own. The strings that controlled her now an inescapable part of her existence. And as she moved across the stage, as she performed for the silent, unblinking audience of marionettes, she realized something that made her blood run cold. The puppeteer wasn't just controlling the puppets. The puppeteer was controlling her. She couldn't stop. She couldn't fight it. The darkness, the malevolent presence that had consumed the theatre, that had turned it from a place of artistry into a twisted prison, was too strong. And the puppeteer, her uncle, if that's what he had been, was still here, still pulling the strings, still watching. Bethany's movements were no longer clumsy. They became fluid, practiced, like the motions of someone who had been doing this for years. She was dancing now, her body moving to a rhythm she couldn't hear, but she could feel it in her bones. She spun, her feet gliding across the floor, her arms lifting with the precision of a professional dancer. The twisted puppet joined her, movements mirroring hers in perfect synchrony. The audience of puppets sat in their seats, frozen, their eyes following every step, every movement, their strings humming with anticipation. The entire theatre seemed to hum with them, as if it were alive, as if it had become part of the performance. "More!" the voice hissed. It wasn't just a command, it was an expectation. Bethany's heart pounded in her chest, and she felt the weight of the puppet's gaze on her, the pressure of the audience's unblinking eyes bearing down on her. She could feel them. She could feel them all around her, the marionettes, the theatre, the presence of her uncle, the puppeteer who had bound them all together. More. The word echoed in her mind, and she couldn't help herself. She danced harder, faster. The movements became more frantic, more desperate. She was no longer aware of where she was, of who she was. The strings were controlling her, pulling her body this way and that, twisting her in ways she couldn't understand, couldn't control. And as she danced, she saw it. The thing that had been waiting for her. It was standing in the shadows at the edge of the stage, just beyond the reach of the dim lights. The puppeteer, her uncle, his presence filling the air like smoke. She couldn't see him clearly, not at first, but she could feel him, as if he were right there beside her, watching her every move. His figure was tall, almost towering, his face hidden in the darkness, but the twisted grin she remembered from her childhood was there, distorted and stretched beyond what she remembered. His eyes glowed with a cold, eerie light, and his fingers twitched as though he were still pulling the strings. Bethany stopped mid-dance, her body frozen in place, and for the first time she felt a rush of clarity. She was no longer simply performing for the marionettes, she was performing for him. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't. The strings, those invisible, insidious strings, were wrapped too tightly around her. The puppeteer had made sure of it. "You belong to me now," the voice whispered. And it wasn't just in her mind, it was in her bones, in the marrow of her very existence. She could feel the words vibrating through her chest, through her limbs. Bethany's breath was shallow now. Her heart raced. The marionettes in the audience shifted ever so slightly, their limbs twitching in unison. They were all waiting for her to finish. But she couldn't finish. She couldn't perform anymore. She wasn't just a puppet. She was a slave to whatever force this was, to whatever dark, twisted power her uncle had unleashed on this place. And the worst part was, she realized she had known this all along. She had known deep down that this theatre wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a trap, a prison, a place where souls went to disappear, to become part of the show. And she had been brought here, chosen to take the place of the marionettes, to become one of them. "You can't leave," the voice hissed again, louder this time, so close that it felt as if the puppeteer was standing right behind her, his breath on her neck. "You'll never leave. You'll dance forever." And with that, she knew. She knew that she had been chosen for the final act. Her body jerked into motion again, her limbs moving faster, her movements a blur. The puppet with the twisted grin joined her, its limbs shifting and creaking as it twirled alongside her. The rest of the marionettes in the audience stirred too, their bodies twitching as if preparing for the final curtain. Bethany couldn't stop it. She couldn't fight it anymore. The theatre had swallowed her whole, and there was no way out. The marionettes were waiting, the strings were pulling, and the puppeteer was watching from the shadows. She was the show now. And there was no escape. Bethany's legs were moving, but not of her own accord. The dance, her performance, was no longer just a matter of steps or rhythm. It was as though the theatre itself had become a vast living thing, its very walls bending and shifting, pulsating with each movement. She could feel the strings tugging at her, each pull like the heartbeat of some ancient creature buried deep beneath the stage. The audience of marionettes, those lifeless things, their eyes fixed on her, seemed to breathe with her. Every breath she took echoed in the silence. Every step she made resonated in the depths of the theatre like a drumbeat in a forgotten tomb. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything other than perform, but the puppeteer's voice, like the tug of the strings, was inescapable. "You are mine," the voice whispered again, colder now, sharper than before. "You were always mine. You will always dance for me." The puppet on the stage, the one with the twisted grin, moved in sync with her. Its eyes, those hollow black holes, seemed to follow her every movement. She could feel it stare like an icy knife in her gut, cutting away the last of her resolve. It reached for her, its fingers long and skeletal, and for a moment she thought it might touch her, might rip her apart. But then the moment passed, and it simply continued to move in grotesque synchrony with her, like some macabre mirror. The strings above her creaked and groaned, twisting through the rafters, pulling tighter. She could feel them now, pulling at the joints of her limbs, her neck, her back. It wasn't a dance anymore, it was an execution. Each movement felt as though it were slicing through her very soul, dragging her deeper into the nightmare. She couldn't remember how long she'd been dancing. Time was a blur in this place, the air thick with the smell of rot and dust, the weight of the theatre pressing in from all sides. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow longer, closer, as though they were closing in on her, creeping along the walls, stretching their fingers toward her. The audience of puppets watched in silence. They never moved, never blinked. They were just there, their wooden faces frozen in mockery, as if they were the last remaining witnesses, some ancient and forgotten horror. They too were part of the performance now, part of the endless show that would never end. But then something strange happened. The voice, that deep, guttural whisper, faltered. It grew distant, fading just slightly. No, not yet. Bethany stopped mid-step, her body jerking to a halt. For a brief moment, the strings seemed to loosen. The sensation was fleeting, but for the first time since she had stepped onto this stage, she could feel the pull of the puppeteer weaken, the grip on her mind loosening ever so slightly. Her heart raced as the silence between her movements deepened, as though something was happening, something that didn't belong to the rhythm of the dance. For a moment, she felt like herself again. And in that moment of clarity, she saw it. At the far end of the stage, through the haze of fog and the flickering lights, a figure stood. It was familiar, yet distant, an old man in tattered clothes, his face obscured by a hood. She couldn't make out the details, but there was something about him, something that felt as though he were both part of the theatre and outside it. He was watching her, waiting for something she couldn't name. The marionette with the twisted grin stopped. It was as though the entire theatre had taken a collective breath. "No," the voice whispered, sharp and angry. "You cannot see him. He is mine. You belong to me." But Bethany could see him. She could feel him now, not as an audience, but as a presence, as someone who had been hidden in the dark corners of this cursed place for far too long. And suddenly, she understood. She understood everything. The puppeteer wasn't just a man, he was something more, something darker. He had been feeding off this theatre, off the souls that had been trapped within its walls for decades. He had never truly let go of the theatre. He had never truly let go of its strings. And now, after all these years, he was waiting for her to take his place. He was never the puppeteer, Bethany whispered under her breath, barely able to believe what she was saying. He was the puppet. The realization hit her like a wave, crashing over her in an instant. The man who had controlled this theatre, who had made it his prison, had been controlled himself. The strings he had once pulled, the marionettes he had once commanded, had been his chains too, and now it was her turn to break free. She felt the strings above her loosen just a little more. They were still there, still pulling at her limbs, but they weren't as tight. She could move her fingers, her arms, her legs, if only just a little. She wasn't entirely free, but she had a chance. The figure at the edge of the stage took a step forward, and the air seemed to crackle with an electric charge. The shadow in the corner of the theatre shifted, and the walls groaned under the strain, as though they too were waking from a long sleep. "No, you can't," the voice whispered again, this time shrill, panicked. "You belong to me. You'll never escape." Bethany took one shaky step toward the figure, her heart pounding in her chest, her limbs weak from the effort. The marionette with the twisted grin stepped forward again, its movements jerky and uncoordinated, as though it could sense the change, the rebellion in the air. "Perform." The command was a scream now, a desperate, shrill wail that rattled the walls, but it was too late. With one final movement, Bethany reached out, grasping for the last remnants of control, and pulled the strings above her. They snapped like the brittle ropes of an old ship, tearing away from the rafters, leaving nothing but the broken remnants of the theatre's control. The room fell silent. The puppets sat in their seats, unmoving, their strings hanging limp. The figure in the shadows stepped forward, his face now fully visible. It was the man who had been her uncle, his features twisted with age, his body frail and broken. He reached for her, his eyes pleading, but there was nothing left to control. Bethany collapsed to her knees, exhausted, her body trembling from the weight of what she had done. The theatre, the place that had once been so alive with movement and sound, was now empty, silent, as though it had finally exhaled after holding its breath for so many years. And in that silence, she knew something. She had won. She had torn the strings apart, ripped them from the very foundation of this cursed place, and now there was nothing left to bind her. No one would control her anymore. She stood slowly, the remnants of the theatre's grip falling away from her. For the first time she felt free, truly free. But as she stepped toward the exit, she hesitated. The silence was thick now, and she could feel it. Something was still here. The marionettes, the broken puppets, still watched her from the seats. Their eyes were empty, but they saw her. And the stage, though empty of its usual horrors, still felt like a place that could trap her, that could draw her back. But she had escaped, and for the first time she could breathe freely again. As she walked away, leaving the broken theatre behind, she heard one last whisper, a faint and almost forgotten sound. "You'll come back," it said, though it no longer had the power to stop her. "You'll always come back." But Bethany didn't look back. She had finally broken free.